Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early November. I was heading home from work on the Route 217 bus that runs from downtown Portland out toward Tigard. It was already dark by 5:05, that heavy kind of darkness that settles early when the air smells like rain and everything feels half asleep. The bus was half full. A couple of high school kids, an older woman with groceries, one guy in a construction vest scrolling on his phone. I had my earbuds in but wasn't really listening to anything. Around the edge of town, where the route passes a patch of trees near Fano Creek, I looked out the window and saw this light moving above the tree line. It wasn't like a plane or a helicopter. It was smaller and closer, maybe a couple 100 feet up, no sound, no flashing markers. It darted left, stopped, then shot straight up like it was yanked on a string. It stayed there for maybe 3 seconds before it just went out. Not faded. Went out, like someone flipped a switch. A few people on the bus were looking too. I saw the older woman lean closer to the window. The guy in the vest pointed and said something to the driver, who didn't even slow down. Nobody said much after that. The rest of the ride was quiet. I got off at my usual stop near 99W and walked home. The next morning was gray and wet, typical Oregon winter weather. I took the same bus, same time, same stop. When I got on, 2 men were sitting together near the back. They were both wearing black suits, not coats, not rain jackets, actual suits with black ties and white shirts. No hats, no umbrellas, no briefcases. Both had pale skin, short dark hair, and the same sort of build. Average, but stiff, like they weren't used to sitting still. At first, I thought maybe they were co-workers or detectives or something, but there was something off about them. Their suits looked too crisp, like they'd just come from the tailor, but the collars were slightly uneven, like they didn't know how to wear them. Neither one moved or spoke. They just stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the same point somewhere near the front of the bus. I sat a few rows ahead of them, trying not to stare. Every time I glanced back, they were in the same exact position, not talking, not checking their phones. When the bus stopped for passengers, they didn't turn their heads. They didn't even blink as far as I could tell. I remember thinking maybe they were part of some performance art thing, or maybe undercover transit security, but that didn't make sense either. No badges, no radios. When the bus got to my stop near the hospital, I stood up and walked toward the door. As I passed them, I noticed both were wearing identical black shoes, polished, spotless, no visible brand or stitching. I didn't think much of it until I stepped off and realized they'd stood up too. I glanced back through the window as the bus pulled away. They were standing in the aisle facing the door, not looking out, just standing like they were waiting for something. I started walking toward work. Halfway down the block, I heard the hiss of the bus pulling away behind me. Then footsteps. Slow, steady, like someone matching my pace about half a block back. I turned once, quickly. No one there. The sidewalk was empty. That whole day, I felt off, like something was sitting just behind my shoulder. Every time the automatic door opened in the office, I half expected to see them walk in. That evening, I took an Uber home instead of the bus. I didn't tell anyone why. I just said it was raining too hard. When I got to my stop, I looked down the street and saw 2 black sedans parked about 50 feet apart on opposite sides of the road, both running, headlights on. Nobody inside that I could see. I went inside, locked the door, and sat for a while without turning on the lights. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I took a later bus, thinking maybe the timing would be different. But when it pulled up, there they were again. Back row, same seats, same suits. I froze for a second before getting on. The driver looked at me like I was taking too long, so I forced myself to sit near the middle. The 2 men didn't move, didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. About 10 minutes into the ride, the bus hit a stoplight near a construction zone. I looked back again. Both of them had turned their heads slightly, in unison, toward my side of the bus. Not directly at me, just angled, the same degree, same motion. Then, when the light turned green, they faced forward again. No one else seemed to notice. When I got to my stop, I got off quickly and started walking fast toward the corner. I wanted to turn and see if they followed, but was scared to make it obvious. At the next crosswalk, I risked a glance over my shoulder. They weren't there. The bus was already pulling away. I scanned the sidewalk, the shops, the parking lot. Nothing. They were gone. I didn't see them again for a few days, but strange things started happening after that. One morning, I found my back gate unlatched, even though I always keep it locked. Another night, my motion sensor light kept flickering on, even though there was no wind and no movement. Then, one evening, I came home and found a business card tucked into the crack of my front door. No name, no logo, just a plain white card with a phone number printed in black ink. The number had a local area code, but nothing else. I didn't call it. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it. 2 nights later, around 11 p.m., someone knocked on my door. 3 short knocks. When I looked through the peephole, no one was there. My front yard was empty, the street quiet. But as I turned away, I saw the faint reflection of headlights moving slowly past my house, then stopping for a few seconds before driving off. I slept with the light on after that. About a week later, I was waiting for the bus again, trying to convince myself I was just overreacting. The morning was foggy, visibility maybe 30 feet. When the bus pulled up, it was almost empty, except for 2 people sitting in the back. Same suits, same blank faces. I stepped back, pretending to check my phone, and let the bus leave without me. The driver honked once, annoyed, but I couldn't move. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded into the fog. I called in sick that day and walked home. No cars followed. No strange notes, no knocks, just quiet. Since then, I've switched routes. I drive more often now. Haven't seen them again, but I still check the rearview mirror when I stop at lights, half expecting to see those 2 faces reflected behind me, still expressionless, waiting. And sometimes, when the weather turns foggy in the mornings, I catch myself staring at the tree line along 99W, watching for that same darting light. It never shows up, but I can't stop looking. I was driving back from a client meeting on Highway 62, about 30 miles outside of Ashland, Oregon. The sky was overcast, the kind of low gray cloud that makes everything feel muted. I had the dash cam running like usual, just habit more than anything, and I wasn't expecting to catch anything beyond the usual deer or slow trucks. About 10 miles from my turnoff, I saw it. A silver disc, hovering just above the tree line to my right. It moved against the wind, slow and deliberate, like it didn't belong in the sky at all. I didn't scream, didn't even flinch at first. I grabbed my phone to start recording, but it moved faster than I could react. That dashcam I barely checked. Yeah, it got everything. I pulled over to the shoulder, heart thumping, just watching. The object didn't make a sound, no hum, no engine. Just that impossible smooth glide. Then it darted straight up and vanished into the cloud cover. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, not moving, not breathing much, just staring at where it had been. When I finally shook myself, I realized I had no service. My phone had been dead for a couple of minutes, even though it was fully charged. Weird, I thought. I got back in the car, drove home, and uploaded the dashcam footage to my laptop. The video was fine, clear. Silver disc cutting through the gray sky, leaves shaking in the wind beneath it. That night, I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My backyard faces a small patch of woods, nothing more than a few acres, but I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that didn't line up with the trees. I checked my front porch security camera. Nothing. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. Slow, deliberate, 3 times. I peeked through the peephole. No one. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see the street. An unmarked black car idling about 50 feet down the driveway. 2 men inside. Black suits, white shirts, black ties, both wearing sunglasses despite the overcast night. I froze. My first thought was, don't panic, don't make this worse. One of them stepped out slowly, tall, posture stiff. The other stayed in the driver's seat. The guy walking up didn't speak until he was 3 feet from the door. "License plate," he said. Calm, flat. Not a question, more like a demand. I blinked. My plate?" "Yes," he said, "for verification." I hesitated. "Look, I don't know what this is about." He just nodded, took a small notebook out of his coat pocket, wrote my plate down. His handwriting was precise, almost surgical. The way he held the pen, not like a person, like an instruction. I asked him who he was. He didn't answer at first. Then, in a single measured movement, he said, "Department of Vehicular Oversight." He sounded, translated, like he was reading from a script written in another language. I thought about saying no, thought about calling the cops, but nothing came out. He just stood there, perfectly still. And then, almost in unison, the man in the car leaned forward slightly, and the one at my door nodded once. Both were looking straight at me without blinking. The guy at the door closed his notebook, turned, and walked back to the car. Silent. Tires didn't squeal. No engine growl. Just gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, until I finally went back inside. The next day, I went to the DMV to renew my registration. They couldn't find my car. Not a glitch, not a typo. My vehicle, my plate, my VIN erased. I even asked them to check the archived records. Nothing. It was like the car had never existed. The woman at the counter looked at me like I was crazy. I went home, played the dashcam footage again, and it was still there, clear as day. The disc, the trees swaying. Everything. Nothing edited. But I couldn't drive the car anywhere legally. I didn't even get a ticket for it, which felt just as weird. Later that evening, I drove to the highway where I'd first seen the disc. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of anyone else. But I kept catching glimpses in my rear view, black car shapes that weren't there when I turned around fully. I tried telling friends, mostly just raised eyebrows, shrugged shoulders. No one really knew what to say. Even the local news laughed when I mentioned it casually. A few nights later, I saw a black sedan parked a block away. I swear the two men were inside, motionless, staring at my house. I didn't approach. I waited. After maybe 20 minutes, they just drove off. No headlights, no turn signal, nothing. Just gone. I haven't seen them since, but I checked the street lights, the neighbors' yards, my driveway, always looking. The dash cam sits in my living room. I watch it sometimes alone, hoping for a clue, but it's just the same footage. The disc, the trees, the wind. I've kept my old plates in a drawer now. They're worthless legally, but I can't bring myself to throw them away. Part of me keeps expecting them to show up again, asking for verification, checking to see if I'm still paying attention. And honestly, I think they might be. I pulled off at a gas station somewhere along Highway 95 south of Tonopah, a little after 9 at night. I'd been driving since morning, coming up from Arizona on my way to Reno for work. It was one of those places that barely counted as a gas station. Just two old pumps, a single flickering light, and a small building that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 80s. The wind was cold, blowing dust across the lot. I parked beside the pump and sat for a second, stretching my fingers around the wheel. The only sound was the low hum of my engine and the soft ticking of the sign light overhead. The place was empty. No cars, no trucks, nothing. I got out, swiped my card, and started fueling up. That's when I noticed them. Two men standing maybe 20 feet away near the other pump. I hadn't heard a car pull in. They were just there. Both wore black suits, like actual suits, not jackets or work clothes, and black hats. Their clothes were too formal for the setting, and they stood perfectly still. I thought maybe they were travelers like me, maybe hitchhikers who had wandered up from somewhere, but something about them made me freeze. They weren't talking or even pretending to do anything. They weren't getting gas, not moving toward the store, not checking their phones, just standing side by side, both looking directly at me. I remember thinking maybe they were security guys or undercover cops. That stretch of Nevada can be weird. Some military stuff, old mines, even those weird restricted areas around Tonopah. But they didn't have that look. No badges, no gear, no car, just those black suits. I tried not to make eye contact and focused on the pump. I could feel them watching me, though, like the air had pressure in it. I told myself it was nothing. They were probably just locals messing around, but when I glanced over again, they hadn't moved an inch. The pump clicked off. I capped the tank, got back in the car, and started it up. I told myself to just leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked one more time through the windshield. They were both still there, but now they were closer. Not by much, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but I hadn't seen them move. That made my chest tighten. I checked the mirrors. Still no other vehicles around. I threw it in drive and pulled forward toward the exit, keeping an eye on them. Neither one turned their head to follow me, but I knew they were still facing my way. Once I hit the highway, I drove fast, too fast for that stretch of road. After about a mile, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The station's light was barely visible in the distance, just a tiny dot flickering against the desert. That's when I saw a flash. Not like lightning, more like a single bright pulse far on the horizon. It was white-blue, quick and clean, like someone had taken a photo. Then it was gone. I slowed down. The road was empty. My headlights only caught sagebrush and the long, straight stretch of asphalt. I told myself it was probably some distant plane or a reflection off the mountains, but my heart was racing. About 10 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People pass through that route all the time. But after another few minutes, the lights didn't get any closer. I was going about 70, and whoever was behind me kept exactly the same distance. Far enough back that I couldn't make out the vehicle, but close enough that I knew it was there. Every time I changed speed, so did they. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was someone else nervous about driving that stretch alone, but I started to feel watched again. Like the same kind of pressure I'd felt at the station. After another few miles, I reached a small pull-off area with a single streetlight and decided to let them pass. I pulled over and waited, keeping an eye on my mirror. The headlights didn't move. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then shut off my headlights to see better. The instant I did, the other car's lights turned off too. That scared the hell out of me. I sat there in the dark, engine idling, trying to figure out what to do. The desert was silent except for the wind brushing against the car. My phone had no signal. I thought about getting out, but the idea of standing alone on that road felt worse. After maybe 2 minutes, I turned my lights back on. When I did, the other headlights came back on too. But now, they were closer. That was enough for me. I floored it. I drove for at least 20 miles without slowing down, checking the mirrors every few seconds. The road curved, dipped, rose again. The lights stayed behind me the whole time, never gaining, never fading. Then, without any reason, they were just gone. Not turned off, gone. I slowed down eventually, expecting to see them come around the bend or appear over a hill. But the highway behind me was empty. I drove the next hour like that, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I stopped again at a rest area near Beatty. There was another car there this time, a guy in a silver SUV with his window down, smoking. I parked a few spots away and sat there catching my breath. When I finally got out to use the restroom, I noticed something strange on my windshield, a single black business card tucked under the wiper. No logo, no number, no name. Just plain black. At first, I thought it might have blown there, but the night was windy and it hadn't moved. The edges weren't bent or dirty. I didn't want to touch it, but I did. The card was thicker than normal, like plastic, and smooth enough that it almost felt oily. I tossed it in the glove box and didn't think about it again until the next morning. When I stopped for breakfast in Tonopah, I opened the glove box to look at it, but it wasn't there. I checked the floor, the seat, even under the mats. Nothing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. The few people I did tell thought I'd just been tired, or that I'd seen some kind of local prank. I wanted to believe that. But a couple of weeks later, something else happened. I was home in Flagstaff by then, unpacking the car to clean it out. When I opened the trunk, I noticed a small line of dust on the inside of the lid, like someone had drawn a finger across it. The line curved into a shape I can't really describe. Not a letter, not a symbol I knew. Just a looping curve, neat and deliberate. It was faint, like it had been done days ago. And it didn't make sense because no one had touched my car since I'd gotten back. I wiped it off, trying not to think about it, and went inside. That night, while I was making coffee, my phone vibrated on the counter. Unknown number. The message was short. We appreciate your cooperation. No link, no follow-up, just that. I deleted it immediately, turned off my phone, and left it off until morning. When I turned it back on, the message was gone. Not just deleted, no record of it anywhere. I told myself it had to be some scam or wrong number. But every once in a while, especially when I drive that same route, I catch myself checking the horizon for that flash again. And sometimes when I stop for gas, I can't help but scan the edges of the lot for two men in suits, standing perfectly still, not moving, not talking, just watching. They arrived the first night I was alone at the cabin. I had driven down the coast to get away from the city, a week with a sketchbook and a cheap space heater, nothing fancy. And by the third night, I was halfway through a thermos of coffee and thinking the whole thing had been a good idea. The cliff above the little beach was maybe 100 yards from the door, a carved-out notch of dark rock and dune grass that dropped straight into a slice of sand. I'd been watching the tide come and go all afternoon, and when the light died, the place went to that hollow, winded kind of quiet you only get when there's no one else for miles. I was getting the wood stove going when I saw them. Two figures on the bluff, standing perfectly still and looking out at the ocean. At first I thought they were watching the water like any other people. Tide, seal, something. Then I realized they weren't bundled up. Not that kind of bundled up. They were in suits, dark suits, white shirts. Nothing like the fleece and parkas I'd packed. Their shoes caught the last light and didn't have any grit on them. Whoever they were, they might as well have been made out of a different weather. I stepped closer to the sliding glass and then went out to the porch with the mug still warm in my hands, letting the wind take the steam away. The air smelled like salt and old kelp. I called up to them, more out of politeness than anything. "Hey, evening, folks. You get up here okay?" The word left my mouth wet and small in the wind. They didn't move. They didn't move. Not even a blink. One of them leaned. I thought he might turn to look. He didn't. They were both facing the water, shoulders squared as if fixed to watch a long, slow movie. The taller one's hair was close cut and neat in a way that said he didn't do manual work. The shorter one had a face that looked too clean to be my imagination. Nothing in it to tell age or habit. When I waved my arm, both of them turned their heads at the exact same degree and the exact same speed. It was small and mechanic, like two puppet heads rotating on the same axle. The shorter one cocked his head almost as if trying to hear something across the wind, and then, still not looking at me, the taller one called down in a plain voice, "Do you require assistance?" The word came down like a question, but not exactly. It sounded rehearsed, like a phrase someone had practiced once and kept in a pocket. I told them no, I was fine, thanks. And for the next 10 minutes I hovered on the porch while the wind made the house creak and the gulls argued over a crab. They never spoke again. Every now and then I'd catch them slipping into small mirrored motions, adjusting their jackets in unison, the same slide of hand over lapel, and I felt like I was watching a mirror of myself that didn't reflect what I did. At some point, the fog rolled in thick and fast, like someone had dragged a blanket over the bluff. The men remained silhouettes until they were swallowed. I put the mug down and went back inside, shut the curtain, and tried to tell myself 100 reasonable things. They were private investigators, they were part of a film crew, they had a broken down car and were waiting for a tow. None of it fit the way they were dressed or the way their shoes were spotless in sand. None of it fit the stillness. I slept like a man tuned to a metronome, up for an hour, dozing for an hour. And when I finally roused before dawn, I opened the door to check the tide. The beach was a pale, low place under a sky that hadn't decided if it was going to be rain. The first thing that hit me was how even the sand looked. There was a straight, narrow line leading from the bluff to the cabin door. It was not a trail of footprints, not a tracked, scuffed path. The sand lay flat, compressed in a perfect band, like someone had taken a steamroller through it, but only along a single, tight track. I walked down to it. Up close, the sand was packed and firm where the band was. There were no toe marks, no heel impressions, no disturbance of the grain. If someone had walked that line in shoes, there would be edges and little ridges and drag marks. There was nothing. The sand outside the band showed the wind scribbles and a few gull tracks. The band was pristine and wrong. It ran straight from the lip of the cliff to the bottom step on the porch, ending as though someone had taken a single, careful step onto the threshold and then vanished. I checked the bluff. The grass by the edge had not been flattened. The cliff face itself showed the usual gull droppings and brown streaks where rain had run. No prints in the sand up there either. If anybody had come down from that ridge in the night, they'd usually cut a ragged path or leave a trail of footprints in the dune. Not this. The band didn't start at a single point. It seemed to gather itself out of the sand and run like a line someone else had drawn. My first instinct was to call the ranger and file something ridiculous. Someone trespassing on private property at 3 a.m. But I didn't want to make a fuss. The ranger station was hours away in fair weather and unreachable now because the fog made the road slippy. I told myself to take photos and not to be stupid. I went back to the porch, grabbed my phone, and took a long series of shots, making sure the cabin's shadow cut across the band so I could prove where it led. When I looked through the images, the band was clear. There was no discoloration, no footprints. The picture showed the band leading straight to the threshold like a zipper line. After breakfast, cold, eaten standing at the sink, I walked the short road into town. On Main Street, the day felt normal. People getting cups of coffee, the post office window marked with a flyer for the summer concert. I told the owner of the hardware store, a woman named Jan, who shrugged and said things like, coastal towns, and asked if I'd had trouble with raccoons. I laughed, but I felt small. I could say, there were two men on the bluff in suits, and she'd tilt her head and tell me about the new roofing crews. He meant well, but there was that tilt of someone who'd lived near the ocean long enough to not be spooked much. By the time I got back in the afternoon, the wind had turned and the sand was starting to blow soft. I went down to the beach again. The band was still there, like a scar on the grain. I knelt and ran a finger along the edge. It was compacted enough that my fingernail left only a light mark. I dug a little to see if there was anything under it, trash, foil, a footprint embedded, and found nothing but the same compact sand. The rest of the beach had the usual wind lines and the random shell pieces. The band was a thing apart. That evening I got restless and walked up to the bluff, careful where the rocks drop off. The grass there was undisturbed. There were no impressions of boots, no cigarette butts, no bottle caps. A gull skittered past and shrieked. I stood for a long time looking out, thinking maybe I'd see them walk out along the ridge and down, but the horizon stayed quiet and gray. On my way back, I saw a pair of scuffs in the sand at the top of the bluff where two grass blades were bent, like someone had placed a foot there for a moment and thought better of it. Close up, they were nothing. Small impressions, easily produced by a deer or a kid's boot. I couldn't be sure. The last odd thing that week came on a Thursday. I was packing the car to go back to the city. I decided to cut the trip short, partly because sleeping alone felt different after the sand, and partly because I had work piling up, and I noticed the little brass key to the cabin gate was on the kitchen table. It had been hanging on the peg by the door when I left it the first night. I knew I hadn't touched it because I always leave it there when I go out. I don't have an explanation for that. The key was just on the table, clean as the rest of the place. I did what seemed sensible. I took a photo of the band on the beach. I put the key in my pocket. I stopped at the ranger station when the fog let up and told them what I'd found. The ranger listened, then wrote me a note and said they'd send someone by to check on routine. That phrase sounded like something from a bureaucrat who'd seen 100 similar strange nights and filed them away. He asked one simple practical question I hadn't thought about. Did you lock the cabin when you left last night? I said yes. Of course I had. He nodded like that proved something. On the drive north, the fog peeled away as though someone had pulled a curtain back. The radio popped with local weather, the sun was a low coin in the sky, and the little town shrank behind me. I kept glancing at the key in my pocket like it might whisper something. I drove with the windows cracked, the wind picking salt on my face. At a stoplight, a teenager with a dog on the hood yelled something about the score, and I felt the world reasserting itself in the simplest ways. I told a couple of friends when I got home, late and half asleep. They made the polite, interesting noises. One asked if I'd seen men in suits before, a joke because you hear that sort of phrase in whispered stories. I said, no, I hadn't. I don't know what they were. The word that kept popping into my head was watching. But I don't mean watched like someone looking at a house to take something. I mean watched like someone examining the sea. Maybe that's what they were doing. Maybe they weren't human, quite the way human is when you meet them in a grocery store. Maybe I only imagined the line of sand. Maybe the sand compressed because of tide patterns I didn't understand. I go back sometimes, not often. The band in the sand will show up in my head like a page I can't stop turning. The cliff is a place you can stand and feel small and very much in the middle of the world. And what I'll remember is the way two figures looked almost like they belonged on a postcard and almost like they didn't belong anywhere at all. I always check the sand now before I walk barefoot down the steps. I lock the door twice. I leave the light on when I sleep. I tell myself that life is full of little puzzles we can live with, and some of them don't want an answer. I must have only meant to close my eyes for a minute. That's what I told myself when I woke up, anyway. The last thing I remembered was pulling over on that empty stretch of 97 just outside Klamath Falls because my eyelids were getting too heavy. It was close to midnight, and I'd been driving all day from Boise. I parked in a wide gravel turnout by the tree line, engine running, heater on low. I figured I'd rest for 10, maybe 15 minutes, then finish the last hour to my cousin's place. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was the cold. My breath fogged against the windshield. The engine was off, but my hands were still on the steering wheel like I'd never moved. The radio was on, sort of. It wasn't playing music or static, just this low humming tone, almost like when a speaker buzzes even though nothing's plugged in. I looked at the dashboard clock. 4:13 a.m. It didn't make sense. I'd stopped around midnight. The car key was still in the ignition but turned off. I checked my phone. Battery dead. I must have fallen asleep longer than I meant to, but that didn't explain the engine being off. I never turn it off when I nap in the car, especially not in November when it's that cold. For a few seconds, I just sat there trying to get my bearings. It was quiet outside, too quiet. Even the wind seemed gone. My headlights were off, but the dash lights gave off a faint glow. I reached to turn the key, but the car didn't respond. No click, no turnover, just that dull hum from the radio, still steady and even, like a single note held too long. I turned the dial, but it didn't change. The hum stayed. When I looked out the windshield again, something about the light seemed wrong. The world wasn't dark. It had this faint silver tint, like the kind of light you get under a full moon. But there was no moon, no stars, just that same gray wash over everything. I cracked my window to listen. The air was cold and still, and there wasn't a single sound. No crickets, no wind in the trees, no highway noise, just that hum, faint but somehow filling the whole car. I opened the door and stepped out. The gravel under my boots crunched loud, too loud. It was the only sound. My breath hung in front of me, and I looked around. My taillights reflected off something low to the ground behind the car. Wet pavement, I thought, but when I crouched down, I realized the road surface was dry. The reflection wasn't coming from that. It was this faint sheen, like heat shimmer, only colder. I don't know why, but the air felt thicker out there, like humidity before a storm, but the sky was clear. I checked my watch. It read 12:11. I thought maybe the car clock had glitched out. But when I pulled out my phone to compare, it wouldn't even power on. I decided I just needed to get the car started and get moving. I climbed back in, turned the key again, nothing. The hum got slightly louder when I touched the dial like it was responding. Then, just for a second, it cut out completely. The silence that followed was so sharp it made my ears ring. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The turnout behind me wasn't empty anymore. 3 faint lights hovered in a loose triangle above the road, white but dull, like someone shining flashlights through fog. They weren't headlights, not high enough, and they weren't steady. They pulsed in this slow rhythm, bright, dim, bright again. I turned around in my seat, trying to see where they were coming from, but the trees made it hard to tell how far away they were. Maybe 100 yards, maybe more. I waited for the sound of an engine, but there wasn't any. The lights didn't move closer or farther, they just hung there. I thought maybe it was someone parked across the road, their lights reflecting weird through mist. But there was no mist. I could see every outline of the pines in perfect detail, just bathed in that pale gray light. After a minute or two, the hum started again, quiet but rising. It seemed to come from the air itself, not the radio. The lights blinked in time with it, 1, 2, 3, then back again. I don't know how long I sat there watching. At some point, I realized my fingers were gripping the steering wheel again, even though I hadn't started the car. I told myself to leave, to drive away, but I couldn't make my body move. It was like being half asleep, aware but detached. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the lights drifted apart, breaking the triangle. One moved upward, fast, then disappeared completely. The other two dimmed until they were gone. The hum faded with them. Everything went normal again, like someone flipped a switch. The silence broke. The wind started moving through the trees. I heard a far-off truck on the highway. My headlights flicked on by themselves for a second, then off. The dash clock blinked, reset, and showed 4:14. When I turned the key, the car started right away. The radio came back to life mid-song, some late-night classic rock station. I just sat there, engine idling, trying to make sense of what happened. I drove off, slowly at first, headlights cutting through that weak dawn light. I looked in the mirror a few times, but the turnout was empty. I kept driving until I hit a gas station 20 miles out. When I pulled in, the guy behind the counter asked if I'd been out all night. I told him yeah, sort of. He said he'd just seen the sky flicker about an hour earlier, like a power surge. I didn't say anything back. When I went to plug my phone into the charger, it powered on instantly, full battery. The time showed 4:17. But when I checked the car clock again, it said 8:23. The next morning, when I got to my cousin's place, I parked in his driveway and just sat there for a bit before going in. I noticed a faint line of dust on the hood, except for 3 evenly spaced clean spots, like fingerprints, only too far apart for a person. I didn't mention it to him. I didn't mention the hum or the lights or waking up with my hands locked on the wheel like I'd never moved. But for the next few nights, I kept waking up at 4:13 a.m. on the dot, no matter when I went to bed. And sometimes when the house is quiet and I can't sleep, I think I still hear that low tone somewhere behind the walls. Not loud, just steady, like the radio never really turned off. It was late August last year, around 9:30 at night, when I saw them. I was staying at my friend's lake cabin in northern Minnesota, Cass Lake to be exact, while he was out of town. He let me use it for a long weekend, said it'd do me good to get out of the city and off my phone. I didn't argue. The place was quiet, sitting maybe 30 yards from the shoreline. And that weekend, the air was heavy and warm, the kind of humid where you can smell the water from the porch. I'd gone out to the dock with a beer after dark, just to watch the lake. The moon was half full, and the water was glassy, perfectly still. You could hear frogs and the occasional fish breaking the surface, but otherwise it was dead calm. I remember checking the time on my phone, 9:24, and thinking how clear the sky was. Every star was visible, scattered like salt. That's when I noticed the orange lights. They were low, just above the tree line across the lake, moving slowly. At first, I thought they were planes, or maybe helicopters heading toward Bemidji, but they were too low for that and too quiet. There were 4 of them, evenly spaced, gliding in a straight line. I watched for maybe 30 seconds before I realized how strange they looked. They weren't blinking like normal aircraft lights. They were steady, glowing like embers. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The footage started fine. I even whispered something like, "What the hell are those?" while zooming in. The lights kept moving across the lake, perfectly level, perfectly spaced. Then the second one in the line rose slightly, and the others adjusted with it, like they were connected somehow, all keeping the same distance. The whole formation paused for a second, just stopped midair. Then they shifted again, this time forming a triangle. The movement was so clean and smooth it didn't look natural. It wasn't jerky, not like drones. It was like watching something underwater, fluid and quiet. I remember feeling this weird pressure in my ears, almost like when you're driving up a mountain and the air gets thin. Not painful, just heavy. The lights started to drift closer to my side of the lake. I couldn't tell how far. Distance is weird at night, but I swear they crossed half that lake in seconds. My heart was hammering, but I kept the phone up, filming. Then, without any warning, all four lights went out. No fade, no dimming, just gone. The second they disappeared, the frogs and crickets stopped too. It was like someone hit mute on the whole world. The air suddenly felt colder, and I got that stupid crawling feeling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stood there on the dock, waiting for something, a sound, a splash, anything, but it was dead silent. After maybe 10 seconds, I realized my phone screen had frozen. The timer on the video wasn't moving, even though I was still holding it up. I lowered it and hit stop. Nothing happened. The screen stayed stuck on the last frame of the lights. I tried locking it, but it wouldn't respond. Then, out of nowhere, this sharp popping sound came from the lake, like static from a speaker, but loud and physical. The sound bounced across the water and echoed back from the trees. My phone went black right after that. I just stood there, staring at the spot where the lights had been, not sure what to do. After a minute, the normal sounds came back. Crickets, the wind in the reeds, everything like before. It was as if whatever had happened just reset. I went back inside, plugged in my phone, and waited for it to restart. When it finally did, I checked the video right away. The file was there, time-stamped at 9:27 p.m., but it was shorter than I remembered, only 32 seconds long. I hit play. The first few seconds looked normal. You could see the lake, hear the frogs, my voice whispering. Then the lights came into view, just like before, and right when they started to shift into that triangle, the video cut to black. Then there was this loud burst of static. Not digital distortion, I mean real, full volume static, like when an old TV loses signal. It lasted less than a second, but it was so sharp it made me drop the phone. I replayed it over and over. Same thing every time. Lights, movement, then black screen and static pop. The audio flatlined after that. I sent the video to Owen, my friend who owned the cabin. He texted back, "That's messed up. You sure it's not a reflection?" I told him reflections don't move in formations. He didn't reply after that. The next morning, I went down to the dock again, just to see if there was anything in the water or on the opposite shore. The lake was calm, sunlight bouncing off the surface. Nothing looked out of place. No boats, no debris, no burn marks, nothing. But when I looked down, I noticed something strange. The metal cleat where I'd tied the canoe was slightly rusted the night before. I'd noticed because it had left orange stains on my rope. That morning it looked new, shiny. It wasn't polished, it was like the rust had been erased. The wood around it too. There was a faint gray ring in the planks, like something circular had sat there overnight and bleached the color out. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I packed up, locked the cabin, and drove home. When I got back to Minneapolis, I tried uploading the video to my laptop to see if I could isolate the static or get a clearer frame of the lights. But when I opened the file, my media player wouldn't play it. The thumbnail was just black. The file size was listed as 0 bytes. It wasn't corrupted, it was like it had been wiped clean. I checked my phone again, and the video was gone there too. No trace in the gallery, not even in the deleted folder. Every other photo from that weekend was still there, just not that one. I didn't talk about it after that. There wasn't much to say. About 2 weeks later, though, I got curious again. I searched online to see if anyone around Cass Lake had seen anything similar that night. I didn't find anything in the local papers or Facebook groups, but there was one comment buried in a weather forum from someone in Bemidji who mentioned orange orbs over the lake around 9:30. That was all it said. No pictures, no follow-up. I never reached out. Sometimes I think I should have stayed there longer that night just to see if the lights came back. But every time I remember that sound, that short, sharp pop, I'm glad I didn't. It wasn't loud enough to hurt my ears, but it didn't sound right. It was too clean, too sudden, like it wasn't coming from the air at all, more like it came from inside the phone. I went back to the cabin once more this spring, just to check on the place for Owen. Everything looked the same, except for that patch on the dock. It's still there, that faint, pale ring around the cleat. The wood inside the ring hasn't aged like the rest. When the light hits it just right, it almost looks like it's glowing. I was driving east on Route 36, cutting through the flat stretch between St. Francis and Norton, Kansas. It was late November, about 9 at night, temperature just above freezing. The road was dead straight for miles. No other cars, no lights except the faint glow of my dashboard and the occasional farmhouse way out in the distance. I'd been on the road for a few hours, heading back home to Salina after visiting my sister. The sky was clear, no wind, just that quiet, heavy kind of cold air that settles over empty places. I remember glancing down at my phone, mostly just to check if I had service. I use a magnetic mount that sticks to the vent. It's got a little compass feature built into the GPS app I use. Normally, it points steady, maybe drifts a few degrees when I hit a curve. But when I looked that night, it was spinning. Not fast, but steady, looping in slow circles like it couldn't decide which direction I was facing. I thought it might have been the mount messing with it, so I took the phone off and held it in my hand. Still spinning, it stopped for half a second, pointed north, then started turning again, smooth and deliberate. The GPS itself froze too. The little blue dot just sat there, even though I was clearly still driving. After a minute or so, the navigation voice cut out, and the map turned gray, like it had lost signal entirely. I thought maybe I'd hit some kind of dead zone, but I'd driven that route plenty of times before. Never had any issues. Then I noticed the static. At first I thought it was coming from the radio, but the radio wasn't on. It was a faint crackling, almost electrical, coming from somewhere behind the dash. It wasn't constant, more like waves of it, a short burst every few seconds. I tried rolling down my window to see if it was just interference from outside, and that's when I saw it. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile down the road, the sky looked off. There was this patch, maybe the size of a small house if you measured it out, where everything shimmered like heat rising off asphalt, except it was cold enough that I could see my breath fogging the windshield. The rest of the sky was still full of stars, but that section wavered and bent, like something behind it was pressing against the air itself. It wasn't glowing or anything dramatic, just a distortion. But the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't random, like wind. It pulsed faintly as if it had a rhythm. I slowed down, partly because it was weird, partly because the static in the car got louder the closer I got. The compass was still spinning, faster now, the needle just whipping around in circles. I checked my watch. It was 9:12. When I reached what I guessed was about 200 yards from that shimmer, every electronic thing in the car flickered. Headlights dimmed, dashboard lights blinked, and the power steering gave out for half a second. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding, thinking my alternator was dying, but then everything came back on. The shimmer was still there, except it had changed shape. It looked stretched now, elongated across the horizon, like it was flattening itself against the sky. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to see if maybe it was some kind of atmospheric thing, maybe exhaust or mist, but it didn't match anything I'd ever seen. I pulled over onto the shoulder. I don't really know why. Curiosity, I guess, or maybe I didn't want to keep driving toward it without knowing what it was. The static was loud enough now that it felt like a vibration under the steering column. I killed the engine. The sound stopped instantly. I opened my door and stepped out. The cold hit me hard. The night was dead quiet, no wind, no crickets, nothing. The only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine. The air felt heavy. Not thick exactly, just dense. Like it pressed back when I moved through it. I looked toward the distortion. It wasn't as clear from outside the car, but I could still see the shimmer, faint and slow, like ripples on water. I walked a few steps into the ditch, trying to get a better angle. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, the screen was lit but blank. No icons, no text, just white. I held it up and watched as faint lines appeared across the display, like static interference. The compass app opened on its own, and the needle started jerking back and forth again, faster this time, until it froze, not pointing north, but straight up. I don't know what made me do it, but I pointed the phone toward the sky. The white screen flickered, and for a split second, the image darkened like it was trying to display something. Then it went black completely. That's when the static came back. Not from the car this time, but from everywhere. It wasn't loud, just pervasive, like the air was humming. My chest felt tight, like when you're standing too close to a transformer. I turned to get back in the car, but before I did, I glanced once more toward the shimmer. It was gone. Completely. The stars behind it were visible again, clear and sharp. The static faded a few seconds later. I got back in the car, started it, and checked the dashboard clock, 9:46. I stared at that for a while. It hadn't felt like more than 10 minutes, but somehow half an hour had passed. The phone was dead. Wouldn't turn on, even plugged into the charger. I sat there for a bit, watching the road. I didn't see any cars pass the entire time. Eventually, I started driving again, slower than before. The compass stayed frozen for about 20 more minutes before it started behaving normally again. The GPS took even longer. I think it finally reconnected near Phillipsburg. I didn't see any more distortions, but something about the sky looked different after that. Hard to explain. The stars seemed sharper, but also off somehow, like they were too still. When I got home that night, the phone finally powered back on. The battery showed 83%, same as when I'd left my sister's place, but the clock was wrong. It said 2:03 a.m. Every app except the compass worked fine. That one kept glitching out for a week afterward. Sometimes it pointed south no matter which direction I turned. Sometimes it just spun like it had that night. I didn't tell anyone at first. I figured it sounded crazy. But a few days later, I mentioned it to my sister when she called to check if I made it back okay. She got really quiet for a second, then said she'd seen something weird too, earlier that same evening. Around 7:30, she'd stepped outside to smoke and noticed a thin strip of light way out over the fields behind her place. Said it looked like a plane at first, but it didn't move. Just hovered there for a few minutes, perfectly still, before fading out like someone dimmed a bulb. She joked that maybe I'd driven under whatever it was. I laughed, but not really. The next week, out of curiosity, I looked up the stretch of highway where it happened on Google Earth. The satellite image was from the previous year. Nothing unusual, just fields, fences, and the road. But when I zoomed in near the mile marker I remembered stopping at, there was a faint discoloration in the soil just off the shoulder. A pale oval patch, maybe 30 feet wide, like the ground had been bleached. Could have been anything, a fertilizer spill, dry grass, whatever. Still, it lined up almost exactly with where I'd pulled over. I haven't taken that route again since. When I visit my sister now, I cut down through Colorado instead. Adds an hour to the trip, but I don't mind. Sometimes when I'm out late driving, especially on those flat stretches where the horizon feels too far away, I'll glance at the compass on my dash just to make sure it's steady. If it ever starts spinning again, I'm not stopping. It was around 11 on a cold March night when my dog, Scout, started growling at the front window. Not barking, just that deep, low rumble he makes when he's uneasy. He's a golden retriever mix, the friendliest dog you could meet, but he only does that growl when something really bothers him. I was half asleep on the couch with the TV still playing. I remember muting it and listening. The wind was steady outside, you could hear it running through the pines behind the house, but otherwise it was quiet. Scout was sitting stiff, ears up, staring at the window like he was waiting for something to move. I got up and pulled the curtain aside. At first, I didn't see anything, just my reflection and the faint outline of the trees against the dark. The yard light was off. I keep it that way most nights because it attracts moths. The moon wasn't out either, so the only thing visible was the faint snow still crusted on the ground. Then I saw it, this soft glow moving slowly along the tree line. It wasn't bright, not like a flashlight or headlights. It was a pale, milky light, almost like a lantern under fogged glass. It drifted horizontally, smooth and deliberate, pausing every few seconds before sliding further along. It didn't bounce or sway like someone carrying something. It was perfectly steady. Scout's growl deepened when it stopped the first time. I thought maybe someone was out there, a trespasser or maybe a hunter tracking something. But there's no reason anyone would be out there that late. The nearest neighbor is half a mile down the road, and the property backs up into about 50 acres of state forest. I turned off the lamp so I could see better through the glass. The glow had stopped again, hovering near one of the larger trees. I squinted, trying to see if there was someone standing behind it, maybe holding a light. Nothing. Just that faint pulse of white. It moved again, a little faster this time, like it was following the edge of the yard. Then it stopped. I realized it was in line with the back porch now, maybe 50 feet from the house. Scout started whining, pacing in circles. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight and went to the door. I don't know what I thought I was going to do, maybe scare off whoever it was. When I opened the door, the wind hit me hard. It carried this strange smell. Not bad, just sharp, like metal or static. I aimed my phone light toward the trees. Nothing, just snow, weeds, and branches swaying. But the glow was still there, visible between the trunks. When I shined the light at it directly, it faded. Not all at once, but like it was backing away, dimming as it moved deeper into the woods. I stood there for maybe a minute, just watching. My phone light started flickering. Then it shut off completely, even though it was at 70% battery. I went back inside and locked the door. Scout stayed near me, tail low, ears twitching toward the window. I sat back down, phone charging beside me, pretending to watch TV. Every few minutes I'd glance outside, and every time I did, I thought I saw that faint light again, always near the trees, always stopping and starting, like it was looking for something. Around midnight, the house lights dimmed for a second. Just a quick flicker, but noticeable. When they came back, the TV had lost its input connection. The screen was just black with the blue no signal box bouncing around. That's when I heard the noise. It wasn't loud, more like a distant hum or a low electric buzz. It didn't come from outside, though. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, through the walls, the floor. Scout's head snapped toward the hallway, and he started barking. Sharp, panicked barks that echoed through the house. I stood up and listened. The hum pulsed once, then stopped. The air felt charged like the moment before a lightning strike. When everything went quiet again, Scout bolted the kitchen window and started growling all over. I followed and looked out, and the light was back, closer this time. It was sitting maybe 20 feet from the back steps, perfectly still. The glow wasn't round anymore. It looked more like a tall oval, faintly taller than a person. No defined edges, just a shape of light with this soft shimmer around it. I remember whispering, "What the hell?" without meaning to. The moment I said it, the light dimmed slightly, like it reacted to sound. Then it tilted. Not turned, tilted, almost like it leaned sideways. I can't explain it better than that. Scout barked again and lunged toward the door, nails scraping the floor. The light held there for another few seconds, then it just folded in on itself, shrunk down fast and disappeared. No fade out, no movement, just gone. I stood there staring at the empty yard until I realized my hand was shaking. I turned all the lights on in the house and left them that way until I went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I checked the spot where it had been. The snow there was half melted in a perfect circle about 6 feet across. The ground underneath was dry, not muddy, just dry and packed down. The rest of the yard was frozen solid. I checked the power lines, thinking maybe something shorted out and caused the flickering. Everything looked normal. I even walked along the edge of the woods, hoping to find a dropped flashlight or some sign that someone had been there. Nothing. Over the next few nights, Scout stayed nervous. He'd sit by the front window from dusk to midnight, ears pricked, staring out like he was waiting for it. He barked a few times around the same hour it had happened, but I never saw the light again. About a week later, I ran into my neighbor, Denise, at the post office. She asked if I'd seen those weird searchlights over the trees the other night. I told her no, and she said they were too low to be from town and too quiet for helicopters. Her husband had thought they were headlights from a truck on the ridge, but the ridge has no roads. She laughed it off, but when she said it, I felt that same tightness in my chest I'd felt standing by the window that night. That evening, I sat on the porch with Scout. It was calm, no wind, just the sound of dripping water from the roof where the snow was melting. Around 10, the power flickered again. Just once, like a quick blink. I turned to look at the tree line, but it was dark. Then Scout's head jerked up. His ears went back, and he stared at the woods for a long time without making a sound. I didn't see anything. No movement, no glow. But after a few minutes, I realized I could smell that faint metallic scent again, sharp and clean, like after a lightning storm. It passed after a few seconds, and the air went still again. Since then, I've noticed small things, the motion light on the shed turning on randomly, my phone compass spinning for no reason when I stand near the back door, Scout waking me up at night with that same low growl. It always happens around the same time, between 10:30 and midnight. Always when the wind dies down and the woods go quiet. I haven't seen the glow again, but some nights when I'm outside with Scout before bed, I catch these faint flashes out of the corner of my eye, soft, colorless, gone before I can turn my head. Maybe it's nothing, probably is. But when I see them, Scout always looks in the same direction, straight toward the tree line. I started hiking that morning around 5. It was mid-September, just before the mornings started getting too cold, and the sun wasn't up yet when I parked at the trailhead. The place was called Maple Ridge, just outside a small town in Montana where my cousin lived. He'd told me the view from the summit was best right after sunrise, so I wanted to catch it. There was no one else in the lot, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and the air was cold enough that my breath came out in little clouds. The first part of the trail wound through pine trees that blocked most of the sky. Everything smelled like damp dirt and sap. I had a thermos of coffee clipped to my pack, and every few minutes I'd stop to take a sip just to warm up. The woods were quiet, aside from the occasional creak of trees or crunch of gravel under my boots. I remember thinking it was peaceful, almost too still, but in a good way. Then, about 20 minutes in, I noticed something odd. There was a deer standing off to the right side of the trail, maybe 30 feet back in the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd seen plenty of deer around there, but this one wasn't moving. It was a young doe, and it just stood there perfectly still, facing uphill. Even when I stopped walking, it didn't twitch or flinch like deer usually do when they notice you. I watched it for a few seconds, waiting for it to bolt. Nothing. I even coughed quietly to see if it would react, but it didn't. That's when I realized its head was tilted slightly upward, eyes fixed on something above the tree line. I turned to look. Through the gaps in the branches, I could see the sky starting to lighten, that pale blue you get just before sunrise. And there, faintly visible against it, were 3 small lights. They weren't bright like stars or plane lights. They looked almost hazy, like glowing marbles moving slowly behind a thin layer of fog. At first, I thought they were just stars, and I was imagining the movement. But they were definitely shifting. Not randomly, either. They moved together, sliding into a triangular formation, then separating, then drifting back. Slow and smooth, like they were connected somehow. I kept staring, trying to make sense of it. The deer hadn't moved an inch. I remember feeling this weird sense of calm and unease at the same time, like my brain couldn't decide if what I was seeing was normal. Then, just as the horizon started to glow orange, the lights faded. Not all at once, they dimmed one by one until the sky looked empty again. The deer blinked, turned its head, and walked off into the woods. I stood there for another minute before pulling out my phone to check the time. 5:42 a.m. I thought about taking a photo, but the lights were gone by then, and all I would have gotten was a shot of the trees. I kept hiking. The trail got steeper, and as the light came up, everything looked normal again. Birds started chirping, and I passed a few rabbits darting through the brush. Still, I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. By the time I reached the overlook, the sun was up. The lake below was covered in mist, and the peaks across from me were glowing orange in the light. I tried to relax and enjoy it, but something about that moment earlier wouldn't leave my head. Mostly the deer. The way it had stood there so still. I sat on a rock to eat breakfast, a granola bar and a banana, and texted my cousin, Matt, to tell him I was at the top. No signal. I figured I'd message him when I got back down. After resting a bit, I started heading back the same way I came. It was full daylight now, bright and clear. But about halfway down, I noticed something strange again. In a patch of dirt near the trail, there were prints, not mine, and not from boots. They looked like deer tracks at first, but there were a few that didn't make sense. They were spaced far apart, deeper than they should have been, and a couple looked uneven, like something heavy had pressed down one side more than the other. I crouched to look closer, but the ground was damp from dew, and the edges had softened. Still, they didn't look right. That's when I heard it, a low, humming noise, faint but steady. It sounded like wind passing through power lines, except there were no lines out there. I stood up and turned around, thinking maybe it was coming from some equipment or a generator nearby, but there was nothing, just trees. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Everything went quiet again. I decided to keep walking. A few minutes later, I passed the same spot where I'd seen the deer earlier. The area looked the same, except now there were two small patches of flattened grass right off the trail, maybe 3 feet wide each, like something had pressed down evenly in circles. I couldn't tell if it was related, but it made me pick up the pace anyway. The rest of the hike down was uneventful. When I reached the trailhead, 2 cars were parked next to mine. A couple of older guys were unloading fishing gear, and I almost asked if they'd seen anything weird that morning, but I stopped myself. It would have sounded stupid. When I got back to my cousin's place, I told him about it anyway. Matt's one of those guys who loves to tease, so I tried to keep it casual. Said something like, "Hey, we ever see lights out by Maple Ridge?" He asked what kind, and I told him. 3 faint orbs moving together. He shrugged and said he hadn't. Then he joked about me getting up too early and seeing satellites. That was fine by me. I didn't want to argue. But later that night, when we were sitting on his porch having a beer, he mentioned something that stuck with me. "There's a guy over in town," he said. "Used to do night hikes out that way. Said he stopped a couple years back after he heard something. Said it was like a generator that started and stopped out of nowhere. No houses nearby or anything." Scared the hell out of him. I asked if the guy ever said what he thought it was, and Matt just shrugged. "Probably nothing," he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the deer, how its neck had been stretched upward, how its body didn't twitch once. I pulled up a photo of the trail on my phone just to look at it in the dark, and when I checked the time at the top of the screen, it said 5:42 a.m. That same number from the morning. I don't know why, but it made me uncomfortable enough that I flipped the phone over. The next day, I drove back out toward the trail just to see it again in daylight. I didn't hike, just parked by the sign and looked up through the trees. There were a few clouds drifting across the sky, but nothing else. No sound, no strange feeling. On the drive back, I kept thinking about how slow those lights had moved, how perfectly smooth their motion was. Not like planes or drones, just a steady, gliding pattern, completely synchronized. I tried to remember if there'd been wind, but I couldn't. Everything about that morning felt quiet in a way that's hard to describe. I went home the day after that. I didn't talk about it much afterward. Not because I thought people wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't really know how to explain it without making it sound like a dream. Sometimes, when I wake up early and step outside before sunrise, I find myself looking up just for a second. Most mornings, there's nothing but stars and clouds. But once in a while, if the air's still enough, I swear I catch a faint shimmer. 3 soft points drifting in slow circles before fading into the dawn. We were camping near Crater Lake in early August, just a small group of us from college who hadn't hung out together in years. There was me, Alex, my girlfriend Taylor, and 2 friends, Jordan and Max. We'd picked a quiet spot off one of the Forest Service roads, maybe a half hour from the main park area, just far enough that it felt like our own corner of the woods. It was one of those warm, perfectly still nights. No wind, no bugs, just the smell of pine and smoke from our little fire. We'd been sitting around for hours, half talking, half staring at the flames, drinking light beers and making fun of Max for bringing a full-sized pillow. Around midnight, I remember Taylor saying it was weird how quiet it was. She wasn't wrong. Even the crickets had gone silent. At first, we joked about it. Jordan said maybe a bear was watching us. Taylor rolled her eyes. But the silence stuck around. It wasn't just that the bugs stopped. It was like the whole forest stopped moving. The air felt heavier. I pulled out my phone to check the time and noticed I didn't have any signal, not even 1 bar. I said something about it and Max checked his too. Nothing. Taylor tried hers. Same thing. Jordan's was dead already. It wasn't that weird at first. We were deep enough that losing service wasn't unheard of. But it was strange how it happened to all of us at once. We'd had decent reception earlier that night. Even FaceTimed another friend from the site. It just cut out completely in the span of maybe a minute. We sat there for a while just kind of joking about it until Max looked up suddenly and asked if we saw that. At first, I didn't know what he meant, but then I saw it too. A soft light way off in the valley, like a car's headlights shining through fog. Only there wasn't any fog and it wasn't moving along a road. It was too far down and too steady. The light started getting brighter, not fast but steady, until it was lighting up the trees on the opposite ridge like a flash of daylight. The whole forest below us glowed this pale white for maybe 5 seconds, maybe less. Then it all went dark again. No sound, no explosion, no smoke, just light, then gone. For a few seconds, none of us said anything. I remember the fire crackling again, like it had gone quiet too. Jordan whispered something like, "Was that a flare?" But it didn't move like a flare. It had come straight down, smooth and slow, and stopped just above the tree line before fading out. I grabbed my phone and tried to record just in case it came back, but the camera wouldn't open. The screen froze and then crashed to the home screen. Taylor said hers did the same thing. We stayed up for another hour watching that part of the valley. Every now and then, one of us thought we saw something. A flicker between the trees, a quick pulse of light, but it was so faint we couldn't be sure. When we finally decided to call it a night, the woods still felt wrong. The silence hadn't gone away. Even the wind was gone. I zipped the tent up tight, but I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something faint and electrical. Not quite buzzing, more like a distant transformer hum, but it never seemed to come from one direction. Around 3 a.m., Taylor whispered that she had to pee and asked if I'd walk with her. We stepped out with our flashlights, and I immediately noticed how dark everything was. Not just moonless, pitch black. Our lights felt weaker than usual, like they only cut through a few feet of air before dying out. We walked maybe 20 yards toward the tree line, and that's when Taylor froze. She whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first I didn't, then I caught it. That same humming sound, only louder now. It had this slow rhythm to it, like it was pulsing. We stood there listening for maybe 10 seconds, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to move, first behind us, then off to the right, like something big but invisible was passing through the trees. I told her we should go back, and we did, quickly. When we got inside the tent, we heard one last low vibration, deep enough to feel in our stomachs. Then silence again. When morning came, everything looked normal. Sun was up, birds were loud, signal was back. It honestly made me wonder if we'd just been overtired and imagined half of it. But when I checked my phone battery, it was almost dead, even though I hadn't used it much. Taylor's was too. Over breakfast, Max said he'd woken up in the middle of the night and thought he saw the light again through the tent fabric, but he wasn't sure if he dreamed it. He said it was faint, moving slowly across the trees like a flashlight beam from far away. We decided to hike down toward the valley that afternoon. It was steep, but not too bad. The woods down there felt different, damp, colder, even though it was still hot out. We found a small clearing with burned-looking grass, maybe 20 feet across, right where we figured the light had stopped. The ground smelled like metal. There were no tracks, no debris, just that smell and a weird circular patch where the dirt was darker. Jordan joked that it was just campers with fireworks, but nobody laughed. We didn't stay down there long. When we got back to camp, we packed up early and drove home that evening. I didn't think much about it until a few days later, when I was going through my phone. I'd completely forgotten I'd tried to record that night. The video was only 3 seconds long, and it was just black, no light, no sound, except for this low, pulsing hum in the background. Not constant, just rhythmic. It sounded exactly like what we heard in the woods later that night. I showed it to Taylor, and she said she never heard that sound while we were recording. None of us did. But it's there, clear as day. I sent the clip to Max and Jordan, and they both swore it wasn't edited. Max said he'd play it on his speaker, and his dog started barking at it immediately. I don't know what to make of it. It's still on my phone, that short black clip with the humming that none of us heard. Sometimes I play it with headphones just to see if I missed something in the background. The weird part is that if you turn the volume up all the way, at the very end of the clip, right before it cuts off, you can hear something faint. Not a voice exactly, more like a sharp inhale, close to the mic. I've shown it to a few people, and most of them say it's probably interference. I've tried recording in the same spot, and nothing like that ever shows up. We haven't gone camping together since. It was early October, just after the first cold snap of the year, when I went camping alone up near the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. I'd been there plenty of times, a little spot near a stream just off a dirt service road about 5 miles from town. My name's Eric. I'm 37, and I've been camping since I was a kid. I don't spook easily, but that night I came closer to packing up and leaving than I ever have before. It had been a long week, and I just wanted to get away from everything for a couple of days. I got to the site around 4 in the afternoon, parked the truck under a cluster of pines, and set up my tent near the fire ring I'd built years ago. There wasn't another soul out there. No tire tracks, no voices, no distant generators. The air smelled like cold dirt and pine sap, and you could hear the stream about 50 yards away. By sundown, I had a small fire going and a pot of chili warming on my little camp stove. The temperature dropped fast, down into the 30s once the sun dipped behind the ridge line. I layered up, cracked a beer, and watched the flames. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I remember checking the time around 9:30. The fire had burned down to coals, and I was about ready to turn in. I walked a few feet from the site, turned off my flashlight, and just listened. Nothing but the faint rush of the stream and the occasional snap of wood. No wind, no insects, just dead calm. That's when I first heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps in the leaves behind me. Slow and steady. I turned around, shined the flashlight toward the tree line. Nothing. Just the beam bouncing off the trunks and undergrowth. The sound stopped the moment the light came on. I told myself it was probably a deer or raccoon and went back to the fire. Sat for a few minutes, then heard it again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. Same slow, deliberate pace, crunching through leaves. I stood up, light in hand, and turned toward the sound. Again, nothing. The moment I pointed the flashlight, silence. It went on like that for a while. I'd hear footsteps circling the campsite, not running, just a steady walking pace, always staying just far enough out of sight. I tried calling out a few times, half joking, asking if someone was there, but there was never a response. Around 10, I doused the fire and got into the tent, thinking it'd stop once I went quiet. I zipped the flap and lay in my sleeping bag, listening. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. Crunch, 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 circling the tent, slow, measured steps. It would pause for a few seconds, then start again, maybe a few feet over. I held my breath and grabbed my flashlight. The sound was right outside, maybe 2 feet away. I flicked the light on and unzipped the flap fast. Nothing. Just the empty clearing. The trees stood still, not even a hint of wind. I stepped out barefoot, swinging the light in wide arcs. The dirt around the tent was undisturbed, except for my own boot prints from earlier. No tracks, no movement. The sound had stopped completely. I stayed out there for maybe 10 minutes, shining the light into the woods, but there was nothing. No eyes reflecting, no rustle of brush, nothing. I went back inside, zipped the tent again, and lay there trying to calm down. I told myself it was some small animal, maybe multiple ones, moving around and stopping when I came out. But it hadn't sounded like that. It had sounded like a person walking. I finally started to drift off when it came back, even slower this time. Circling again, deliberate and heavy, like someone pacing. Every so often it would stop, dead silent, then start again from a different spot, as if it was walking in a wide loop. I whispered to myself, nope, grabbed the flashlight again, and flicked it on. Silence. I didn't move for a full minute, listening. Then, from way out in the trees, I heard the faintest crunch, maybe 100 feet away, like something retreating. I kept the light on until the batteries started to dim. When I finally shut it off, I couldn't tell if the sound stopped or if I'd just gone numb to it. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something brushing against the tent fabric. So faint I wasn't sure if it was real or in my head. At some point I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was early morning. Pale light coming through the nylon. Everything was dead quiet. No birds yet, no movement. I crawled out expecting to see tracks or something disturbed around the campsite. but the ground was untouched, not a single mark that wasn't mine. The woods looked normal, calm, beautiful, ordinary. I walked a slow circle around the tent, scanning the ground carefully. The soil was soft, slightly damp from dew. If someone had been walking there all night, I should have seen prints, but there was nothing, not a thing. I cooked breakfast anyway because I was too tired to pack right away. The whole time I kept glancing at the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound. Around 9, I decided to leave. I packed up, loaded the truck, and before I got in, I took one last walk down to the stream. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Across the water, on the opposite bank, there was a small break in the trees, like a narrow game trail. And there, half hidden in the brush, I saw something metallic. A small circular object about the size of a dinner plate, lying flat on the ground. It was too smooth and perfectly round to be trash, and it caught the light oddly, almost dull but reflective at the same time. I crossed the stream, boots sinking into the mud, and got closer. It wasn't metal exactly. The surface felt warm. Not hot, just warmer than the air. There were no seams or markings on it. When I touched it again, it gave a faint vibration under my fingers, like a phone on silent just for half a second. Then nothing. That was enough for me. I backed away and went straight to the truck. The drive out felt longer than usual, and I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the dirt road behind me. I didn't. When I got home, I checked my phone. The GPS track from my hiking app showed something strange. Between 9:47 and 10:10 p.m., there was a gap in the recording. Like the app had stopped tracking for a bit, then resumed in the same exact spot. I don't know if it was a signal issue or what, but it lined up exactly with the time I'd heard the footsteps the most. A few weeks later, I went back with my friend Mark. We hiked down to the same spot, and I showed him where I'd camped. The area looked exactly the same, except the round object by the stream was gone. No trace of it. We looked for a good hour and found nothing. He laughed it off, said I probably imagined half of it. But I know what I heard. I know the way those footsteps moved. Slow, steady, circling. Not animal sounds, not wind. Something walking, thinking, waiting. I haven't camped alone since. I still go sometimes, but always with someone else. Always with 2 flashlights and a fire big enough to light the trees. And even now, when the woods go quiet and the night gets heavy, I can still hear it in my head. That steady crunch of footsteps in the dark, circling, stopping, waiting for the light to go out. It happened last November, a little after 10 at night. I live just outside of Taos, New Mexico, about 15 minutes out, where the houses thin out and it's mostly sagebrush and dirt roads. It's quiet out here. Most nights, the only sound is the wind through the fence wire and the coyotes if they get bold enough to come close. That night, it was cold and still. No wind, no traffic on the highway, just this heavy quiet that happens after the temperature drops. I was inside watching something dumb on TV when my dog, Murphy, started barking from the back door. He's a rescue, part shepherd, part something else, and usually doesn't bark unless someone's close to the property. At first, I thought it was a coyote or maybe one of the neighbor's goats that had gotten loose again. I muted the TV, and that's when I realized how serious his barking sounded. Short, sharp bursts, his hackles all up. I got up and went to the sliding glass door. He was standing on the porch, staring straight up. Not at the yard, not toward the fence line, straight into the sky. I didn't see anything at first, just stars. Out here you can see a million of them, especially on a cold night with no moon. I stepped outside, thinking maybe he saw a plane or one of those low satellites that pass overhead. But it wasn't that. He was locked onto one specific spot, dead still except for the barking. I told him to knock it off, but he wouldn't even look at me. I followed his gaze, and that's when I noticed it. A faint light, almost like a shimmer, in the exact spot he was staring at. It wasn't bright, more like a soft, diffused glow. At first, I thought it was a star behind thin cloud cover, but there were no clouds. The sky was perfectly clear. The glow pulsed once, just a little brighter, then dimmed again. I squinted and tried to focus, but it didn't behave like anything I'd seen before. It wasn't moving, wasn't blinking like a plane. It just hung there, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, it faded away. Murphy stopped barking immediately. His ears stayed up, but he went silent. Then he looked at me back at the sky and gave this low, uneasy growl. I stood there another minute, watching. Nothing. The sky was back to normal. I figured maybe it was a trick of the eyes. Cold air, dry night, maybe some atmospheric reflection or something. Still, it bothered me. I walked down to the edge of the yard, past the old wooden gate, and looked again. Same patch of sky, totally blank. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. No crickets, no distant dogs, no traffic hum from the highway, just dead still. It wasn't something I noticed right away, it just crept up on me. I went back inside and tried to settle down, but Murphy stayed alert. He paced between the sliding door and the window for the next half hour, whining softly, tail down. I finally let him sleep inside the bedroom, which I never do because he sheds everywhere. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to him whining again. Not barking this time, just low, nervous sounds. I looked over and he was sitting up on the bed, staring toward the window. I listened, but there wasn't any sound outside. No movement, no lights. The digital clock said 2:13. I started to roll over when something flickered across the curtains. It wasn't a car passing or a flashlight beam. It was too diffuse, too soft. Just this faint light moving across the window, like a reflection from something distant but close enough to cast across the fabric. I froze, waiting for it to repeat. It did twice, a few seconds apart. Then nothing. I got up and pulled the curtain back a few inches. The yard was dark. Porch light off, security light near the barn still on. But beyond that, nothing. I left the curtain cracked and sat there watching. Murphy didn't move. I swear it felt like the air was thicker than normal, like something pressing down on the whole property. Not heavy, exactly, just strange. After about 10 minutes, I gave up, turned the light on, and went to get some water. Murphy followed me into the kitchen, tail tucked. When I looked out the sliding glass door again, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The security light by the barn, which is on a motion sensor, was flickering, like something was moving back and forth under it. There shouldn't have been anything there. That light only comes on if something crosses within 15 feet of the barn door. I stood there watching it blink on and off, trying to make sense of it. The timing wasn't random. It was too steady, like something passing rhythmically through the sensor's range. After maybe 30 seconds, it stopped flickering. Then, just like that faint light earlier, it went completely out. The yard went black. Murphy growled again, but he didn't move from my side. I opened the sliding door just a crack and stepped onto the porch, holding my phone flashlight low. The wind had picked up a little by then, carrying that dry dirt smell, but otherwise everything looked normal. No movement. Then I noticed it again. The faint glow up in the same patch of sky as before. Not bright enough to light anything around it, but steady this time. I stared for maybe a full minute. It didn't move or pulse. It just sat there, motionless. Then, right when I thought maybe it was a star or satellite I hadn't noticed before, the glow dimmed and blinked out completely. When it vanished, every light on the property came back on. The porch, the barn, even the little LED on the water pump shed. All at once. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I walked the property, checking for any sign of animals or people. The dirt near the barn was undisturbed. The motion sensor was fine. Everything looked exactly the same. The only weird thing I found was Murphy's water bowl, which I keep under the porch. The surface of the water had this thin white residue, almost like fine dust. I dumped it and refilled it. That evening, around dusk, I called my neighbor Troy, who lives about half a mile down the road. I asked if his dogs had been acting strange or if he'd seen any weird lights the night before. He hesitated for a second, then said his wife had woken him around midnight because their dog was barking at the back fence just nonstop for several minutes. When he went out to check, he didn't see anything, but he mentioned something odd. He said it looked like the air above the pasture was glowing a little. He thought it was distant lightning, even though there hadn't been any storms. After that, nothing else happened. No more lights, no hums, no barking fits. Life went back to normal. 2 weeks later, though, I found something that made me think about it again. I was out by the barn, replacing a section of fence, when I noticed a small patch of the ground, maybe 3 feet across, where the dirt was discolored, lighter, almost ashy looking. The grass around it was fine, but that one patch looked like it had been bleached somehow. I poked it with a stick, half expecting to find something buried, but it was just dry soil. No smell, no heat, nothing unusual except the color. Murphy wouldn't go near it. He walked a wide circle around and stood behind me, whining softly until I gave up and went back inside. I haven't seen that glow again since, but sometimes, when I let him out at night, he'll stop halfway down the porch steps and stare at that same spot in the sky. Doesn't bark anymore, just watches, quiet and still, like he's waiting for something I can't see. It was the second morning of a solo hiking trip I took in late September 2022. I was in the Adirondacks on the west side of Long Lake. Not on the main trail. I'd bushwhacked in from an old logging road I found on a satellite map, trying to reach this little crescent-shaped inlet I'd spotted that didn't look like many people had camped there. I'd brought my dog, Tansy. She's a wiry little pointer mix, good nose, and better instincts than me half the time. We'd set up camp about 50 feet back from the shoreline, tucked under some pines where the ground was soft with old needles. No other hikers, no boats on the lake, just loons calling out now and then. It had rained the night before, light drizzle off and on, so the soil was damp and everything smelled like wet moss and bark. That morning, it was foggy. Not heavy, but enough to blur the tree line across the water. I'd gotten up early, maybe around 6:30, and was making coffee over the little camp stove while Tansy sniffed around near the shore. She let out this low, questioning bark, not aggressive, just enough to get my attention. I walked down to where she was, maybe 15 feet from the edge of the water. She was standing completely still, tail stiff, ears up, staring at the ground. At first I didn't see anything, but when I got closer, I noticed these 3 perfect circular impressions in the dirt, each maybe 10 inches across. Not holes, more like someone had pressed big round molds into the soil and then lifted them away. The edges were sharp, about 2 inches deep, just perfect circles, no scuffs, no slide marks, no boot prints. They were lined up in a triangle, 1 in front, 2 behind, like tripod legs, spaced evenly, like exactly evenly, maybe 5 feet apart, center to center, and then about 5 feet ahead of that front one, there was another identical set, and another 5 feet after that, another. Each triangle was oriented the same direction, leading straight into the water. Tansy wouldn't go near them. She skirted wide around and kept sniffing the air. Not the ground, the air. I crouched down and touched the edge of one of the prints. The soil was damp, like the rest of the ground, but compacted, like something heavy had rested there. Whatever made them hadn't walked. There were no footprints, no dragging marks. Just those prints, perfectly spaced, like it had hopped or hovered between points. I followed the trail down to the water. The last set of impressions was right at the edge, half in the wet sand, half in the shallows. Then nothing. No ripple trail, no bubbles, no disturbance at all in the water. That part of the lake is maybe 6 or 7 feet deep near shore. You can usually see the bottom pretty clearly, but with the fog and the light, it was all gray. I stood there for a few minutes, just listening. Waiting, I guess. But the woods were dead quiet. No birds, no breeze, not even squirrels. Tansy had sat down behind me and was staring out at the water, the way she does when she's watching deer from a distance. Alert, but unsure. I should mention, there was one other odd thing I noticed. The prints didn't break any twigs. There were dry pine needles and a few thin sticks scattered across the ground, and they weren't snapped or crushed. Just pushed down smoothly, like they'd been pressed with even pressure. I went back to camp, grabbed my phone, and tried to take a few photos. But the fog kept messing with the autofocus, and for some reason the pictures came out weird, blurry in places that didn't make sense, like smudges across the lens, except the lens was clean. I gave up and sat at the fire ring, sipping cold coffee and trying to think it through. Around 8:30, I noticed Tansy had retreated all the way under the tarp we'd hung. She does that when she's stressed. She wouldn't come out even when I opened a pack of jerky. So, I stayed close to camp the rest of the day, read, sketched, kept the fire going. I didn't see or hear anything else. But around 4 p.m., I went back down to the shore, and the prints were still there. Untouched, no animal tracks over them, no new impressions, just those same perfect circles leading into the lake. That night was dead calm. Fog thickened again after sunset. I kept the fire going until nearly midnight, just for the comfort of it. Tansy wouldn't sleep outside the tent. She curled right up against me and twitched all night like she was dreaming something bad. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I stepped out of the tent with my flashlight, and everything was still fogged in, but it was silent. Like, not just quiet, but hollow, sounding. You could hear your own breath too loud. That kind of quiet. I walked just a few feet from the tent, behind the tarp, and that's when I noticed the air felt charged. Like static before a thunderstorm, but there were no clouds and no wind. My hair stood up on my arms. The flashlight flickered once, then stayed on. I finished and turned back, and that's when I heard this distant sound from the direction of the lake. It wasn't loud. It was more like a hum, or no, not quite a hum. More like a tone, a single note, not changing in pitch, but somehow layered, like it had depth, like it wasn't from something, but part of the air itself. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then gone, back to silence. Tansy was wide awake when I climbed back into the tent. She kept her head up for an hour after that, just watching the entrance. Next morning, the prints were gone, not filled in, not muddied or disturbed, just gone, like someone peeled them out of the earth and smoothed over the surface. Same damp soil, same pine needles, but no trace they'd ever been there. I packed up that morning and hiked out early. Got turned around twice on the way back to the old logging road, even though I'd marked the trail with flagging tape. My compass was jittery too. Needle kept drifting a few degrees back and forth. Settled down after I was about a half mile away from the lake. I haven't been back to that spot since. Don't really want to. It started with that humming sound around 3:15 in the morning. I was awake because of the dog. Lula had been whining at the bedroom window, pacing, doing that low woof she only does when there's coyotes around. I live alone on a little farm outside Elkins, West Virginia. Closest neighbor is about a half mile down the road. Lula's usually dead quiet at night unless something's up. So I got up thinking maybe there was a raccoon in the chicken run. Grabbed the flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. That's when I heard it. The hum. It wasn't coming from the barn or the woods behind the house. It was just everywhere. A low, even tone, like the sound power lines make when it's humid, but deeper. More constant, almost smooth. I could feel it in my chest, like when you're standing near a big engine, but nothing was shaking. The flashlight worked fine. Lights in the house were still on. No wind. No bugs chirping either, which was strange for August. Lula didn't want to come off the porch. She just sat there, staring toward the north field, ears low, not growling, just watching. I walked out past the garden, thinking maybe it was a combine on the old access road up the hill, but I didn't see any lights. And the humming didn't change the closer I got to the edge of the trees. Just stayed the same. Steady. Toneless but heavy. Then, after maybe 2 minutes, it cut off. Just like a switch. No fading, just gone. Everything went dead silent after that. I stood there for a while, scanning the tree line, listening. Lula still wouldn't come down. After maybe 5 minutes, I gave up and went back inside. That's when I noticed the microwave clock. It said 2:32, which made no sense because I knew I'd looked at my phone in bed just before Lula started whining, and it had said 3:15. I even checked again. Phone said 3:21 now. I went to the living room, checked the wall clock, 2:32. Oven, 2:32. Battery-powered clock in the hallway, 2:32. All of them were stuck there. I thought maybe the power had blinked, but the lights hadn't even flickered. My phone was still on full signal and battery. I tried resetting the microwave clock, no response. It just stayed frozen. The buttons made the beep like normal, but the numbers wouldn't change. Same with the oven. So I went out to the barn. There's an old LED radio clock in there, runs off an extension cord from the main house. That one said 2:32 too. Frozen. I tried unplugging and plugging it back in, nothing. Light came on, but numbers didn't move. Same digits. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just sat on the couch with Lula, who finally came in and curled up tight at my feet. Every now and then she'd look toward the back windows, like she heard something I didn't. Next morning, none of the clocks had changed. Still 2:32, even the ones that weren't electric. I've got this old wind-up travel clock like my grandpa gave me. It's not accurate down to the second, but it ticks loud enough you can hear it from across the room. It was still ticking when I checked it, but the hands hadn't moved since the night before. Just ticking in place. Like stuck gears, except nothing was jammed. I could hear the mechanism clicking. I turned the dial to try to reset it, but the hands wouldn't budge, like they were locked. That's when I started feeling weird, like lightheaded. Not dizzy, but like I was floating a half second behind everything I did. Hard to explain. Lula wouldn't leave my side, and when I went out to feed the goats, she wouldn't step past the back porch. Just sat and stared again. Same direction, Northfield. I called my sister, asked if they'd had any outages in town. She said no. I asked if her clocks were fine. They were. She didn't think much of it until I told her mine were all stuck, even the ones that didn't need power. She joked about magnets or something. I don't have anything strong enough to do that. And besides, how would a magnet freeze an old wind-up clock? I tried taking the batteries out of the hallway clock and putting in new ones. The screen lit up like normal, beeped once, then showed the same time. 2:32. Nothing else. No way to reset it. The buttons did nothing. That evening, I sat out on the porch with a beer and just watched the woods. I didn't want to go back in the house. Everything felt wrong. I don't even know how to say it. The air felt off, like static. Lula paced the porch nonstop. Her hackles weren't up, but her tail stayed low. Around 8, I noticed something else. My watch, an old Seiko I wear out in the field, was running, but it was exactly 43 minutes behind my phone. I reset it. It worked fine for a bit. Then the next morning, it was 43 minutes behind again. I thought I was losing it. Checked the manual, looked online, nothing about a delay or time drift like that. So I started writing down the times. Every clock in the house was frozen at 2:32, and my watch was resetting itself, drifting back. Exactly 43 minutes off from standard time every night. I tried putting it in a drawer across the house. Still drifted. I left it in the barn. Still drifted. Day 4, I took it into town, left it on my sister's kitchen counter. Came back 6 hours later, still matched, real time. Perfect. Brought it back to the farm. Next morning, 43 minutes behind again. I called a friend of mine who does electrical work, asked if some kind of faulty wiring or grounding issue could mess with clocks. He said maybe a power surge could fry a circuit, but it wouldn't freeze time on a battery-operated device, and certainly not a mechanical wind-up. Said if my whole place was magnetized or something, I'd have bigger problems. I thought about calling the electric company. Thought about calling someone else, honestly. Anyone. But what do you say? Hey, every clock I own is stuck on 2:32 and my watch keeps time traveling 43 minutes behind schedule every night? No one was going to believe that. The thing that really got to me, though, was on the 5th night. I'd gone to bed around midnight. Didn't sleep much. Just laid there with Lula curled up by my legs. At 3:15, almost on the dot, I heard the hum again. Lula sat up straight, started whining, but didn't bark. I got up and looked out the window, couldn't see anything, just moonlight and trees. But the hum was there, steady. No pitch changes, no direction. I went to the kitchen, phone in hand, started recording audio. I held the phone up to the window, trying to catch it. Then, without warning, the screen blinked. Whole phone reset. When it came back on, the recording was gone, like I hadn't even opened the app. And the time? 2:32. I stared at it for a long time before opening the clock app. That showed the real time, 3:17. But the lock screen still said 2:32. When I rebooted again, it fixed itself, but the hum had stopped. Since then, it hasn't come back. The clocks are still frozen. My watch still drifts overnight unless I leave it in town. I took the wind-up clock apart just to see if something was jammed. All the gears were intact, clean, nothing broken. It ticks when you wind it, but it doesn't move. Just sits there. 2:32. I worked as a satellite technician for a mid-sized aerospace company out in Colorado Springs, mostly doing shift work in a windowless control room filled with screens, blinking lights, and way too much coffee. My job was pretty straightforward. Monitor satellite telemetry, check for any anomalies, and make sure everything stayed online and on track. Nothing glamorous. Mostly, it was just staring at radar blips and data points for hours at a time. But there was this one thing I couldn't explain. It started about 6 months into the job. On the monitoring software we use, there was this object that popped up sometimes. It wasn't part of any known satellite constellation or debris field. It wasn't moving like a satellite should either. Satellites follow predictable orbits, right? This thing, though, would show up at random positions on the screen, never twice in the same spot, sometimes close to the horizon line, sometimes far overhead. And it wasn't orbiting, at least not in any way that made sense to me or my team. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was a glitch. The radar or sensor must have had some interference or a bug in the software, but every time it appeared, it was on a different scan at a different spot with no pattern at all. What made it creepier was the fact that it never stayed long enough for a second scan to confirm it. The monitoring system refreshed every few minutes, but this thing vanished before the next refresh. I couldn't lock onto it or get any data, just a blip that popped up, then disappeared. I asked around, mentioned it to a few coworkers casually, but no one else seemed to notice. Maybe they did and just dismissed it. I even checked with my supervisor, but they waved it off as sensor noise or space junk. One night during a late shift, it showed up again. I was working solo, which was typical for the graveyard shift, and staring at the screen felt more isolating than usual. The control room was silent except for the hum of the air system and the occasional beep from a status alert. I saw it blink onto the screen near the edge of coverage, small, round, and bright enough to catch my eye immediately. I zoomed in the radar display, trying to get a better look. The coordinates flashed. It was over the southwestern US, but not following any known orbit path. I tapped the track button, hoping to follow it on the next scan. The system started the countdown, refresh in 60 seconds. I leaned forward, eyes glued to the monitor. Right before the update, the blip shifted. Not in a smooth curve like a satellite moving along a trajectory, but like it jumped. A few seconds later, it vanished altogether. I checked the logs. No satellite or object matching that signature had been cataloged. The area it last appeared over was mostly empty desert. I spent the next few weeks obsessively checking every scan, waiting for it to reappear. It always came back, but in a different place, with no pattern, and always vanished too quickly to catch more than a fleeting glimpse. A few times I tried calling in to my supervisor during the day to tell them what I'd seen. They kept saying it was just interference or glitches and that I shouldn't worry. But it bothered me. This wasn't normal. One night, I even tried recording the radar feed with my phone, thinking if I caught it on video, I could prove it existed. The video showed a brief blip appearing and disappearing, but every time it happened, the screen's timestamp jumped backwards by about 30 seconds, like the system was resetting briefly. I watched the clip over and over, but couldn't explain that either. The system I worked with was supposed to have strict logging and timing, so that anomaly didn't make sense. A few other odd things happened around the same time. My home Wi-Fi started cutting out sporadically, with no clear reason. My phone battery drained faster than usual, and I'd find my apps behaving strangely, like notifications popping up seconds before I got the messages. One night, about a month after I first noticed the object, I took my dog Bixby for a walk around my suburban neighborhood. It was late, maybe 11:30 p.m., and the sky was clear and cold, the kind of crisp winter air that makes your breath cloud in front of you. I had my phone out checking the satellite tracking app. Yeah, I'm that obsessed. And Bixby was sniffing every tree like usual. I stopped and looked up. The stars were bright and steady, but there was something else. A faint glimmer far off, moving slowly, but not like any plane or satellite I'd ever seen. It wasn't flashing, and it wasn't making noise. Bixby suddenly stiffened and growled low. I tugged on his leash, telling him to calm down, but he wouldn't look away from the sky. The light disappeared, just like the blip on my screen. I thought maybe I was just tired, imagining things. Back at work, I told a few other night shift techs about the dog reacting to the sky, but they just shrugged. The job was draining, and most people were glad to hear something breaking the monotony. One evening, the tracking system glitched again. The object appeared twice on the screen at opposite ends of the coverage area. I blinked, then zoomed in. Both blips pulsed faintly, like they were sending signals or just flickering. The system froze for a second, then both vanished at once. Right after that, my workstation screen flickered and shut off. The backup kicked in, but the system was slow to reboot. When it came back online, the log files for that night had a weird gap, about 5 minutes of missing data. I reported it, but no one else saw anything unusual. The official explanation was a temporary power surge at the facility. That night, after my shift, I drove home under a heavy cloud cover. The streetlights blurred through the fog, and I kept glancing up, half expecting to see the object again. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my front porch light flickering. I didn't have a chance to think before Bixby started barking, low and urgent. I opened the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. I checked my phone. The tracking app was frozen on a blank screen. I shut it off, put it down, and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I felt like I was being watched. I never told my family about the blips or the weird things at work. They'd think I was losing it, or worse, that I was bringing some kind of paranoia home. A few days later, the object appeared again on the scans. This time I tried to alert my supervisor, pressing the emergency alert button, which was only for serious malfunctions or safety issues. A voice came through the speaker, calm and clipped. Technician, cease tracking unknown objects. Continue monitoring only registered satellites. Report anomalies through official channels. This message will be repeated. The line cut off abruptly. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. After that, I stopped trying to track it. The blips kept appearing, always in different places, always vanishing before anyone else could see them. I kept my head down, did my job. But sometimes when I'm alone at work, late at night, I still see the faint flicker on the radar, like a ghost signal. And the feeling of being watched doesn't go away. I was camped out alone near the Lake Jocassee, up in the Blue Ridge foothills. I'd been hiking all day and pitched my tent around dusk, just off one of the side trails. Nothing official, but there was a decent clearing under some pines. It was early October, and the air had that damp, leaf-mulchy smell, cool but not cold. Sky was clear. Moon was almost full. I'd packed light, just the basics: one-person tent, foam pad, sleeping bag, stove, water bladder, and a small dry bag with food. I made some instant rice and tuna, listened to a few songs on my phone, then zipped everything up and called it a night around 10. I remember putting my boots under the flap right outside the door and tucking my pack inside at the foot of my sleeping bag. I always do that to keep animals from chewing on anything. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and leaves shifting in the breeze. It was quiet, but not silent. The usual woods noise. Then, sometime deep into the night, I woke up. I couldn't tell what time it was. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see anything at first. Everything was just white. Not bright white like a flashlight in your face, more like a heavy fog, glowing from all directions. The whole inside of the tent was filled with it. There were no shadows, no corners, just light. And it was silent, completely, absolutely silent. That's what got me. It wasn't just that I couldn't hear anything outside. I couldn't hear anything. No wind, no insects, not even the rustle of the sleeping bag when I shifted. I couldn't hear myself breathe. I remember opening my mouth to try and say something. I could feel my jaw move, feel the vibration in my throat, but there was nothing. No sound. I sat up, or thought I did, but it felt slow, like I was underwater. My limbs moved, but not the way they were supposed to. There was this weird delay, and my arms felt heavier than they should have. I tried to unzip the tent, but I couldn't find the flap. My hands just kept passing through light. It was like the tent wasn't there anymore, like the space around me had changed, but I hadn't caught up. Then everything faded out. Not suddenly, more like something dimming the world around me. The white glow sank away like a light being swallowed, and I don't remember anything else. When I came to, it was morning. Sun was coming through the trees. The first thing I noticed was how hot and cramped I felt. My mouth was full of something. I coughed and realized I had my pack half on my face. My sleeping bag was tangled around my legs, and my camp stove was jammed against my ribs. All my gear was inside the tent with me. All of it. The bear bag, which I'd strung up 20 feet away before bed, was lying across my chest. My boots were in there too, still muddy, wedged under my knees. The dry bag with food, the fuel canister, the trekking poles. Everything I'd left outside or packed away was now just piled on top of me. It was like someone had dumped all my gear on me in the night, and zipped the tent shut again. I sat up slowly. My head was pounding. I had this dull ache behind my eyes, like a dehydration headache, but worse. My throat felt raw. When I unzipped the tent and looked around, the woods were quiet again. Normal quiet. Birds chirping, a squirrel tearing around up in the trees. I staggered out and immediately saw the rope I'd used for the bear bag. It was still tied around the same branch, but the knot was undone and the line was hanging limp, almost touching the ground. The bag had been cut clean open, not clawed, not chewed, just a straight, smooth slice. My boots were damp, like they'd been in wet grass, but there hadn't been any dew the night before, and the tread was packed with a reddish mud I didn't recognize. Not the kind of dirt in that part of the forest. Too fine, too clay-like. I checked my phone. It was dead. Battery had been around 60% when I went to sleep, but now it was black. Wouldn't even show the charge icon when I plugged in the solar pack. Everything felt off. I wasn't missing any time as far as I could tell. The sun was about where it should be, early morning, maybe 7 or 8, but it was like I hadn't really slept, like my body had been through something and hadn't caught up. When I broke camp, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Just outside the clearing, maybe 30 feet into the brush, there was a small circle in the grass, maybe 5 or 6 feet across. The ground there was flattened, not trampled, just pressed down like something heavy had rested there. No scorch marks, no tracks, just a perfect round patch where the plants were bent outward in every direction. I checked for signs of animals, but didn't see anything. No fur, no droppings, not even broken branches nearby. Just that one weird, quiet circle in the middle of the woods. I hiked out before noon, didn't stop for lunch, didn't look back. When I got to the trailhead, my phone finally powered on. I had no service, but it showed the time as 3:47 p.m. The date was the same. Nothing skipped. No lost day, no unexplained entries or photos. But when I opened the voice recorder, an app I never used, there was a new file from the night before. It was exactly 1 minute long. I played it. It was blank. No voices, no background sound. Just 1 solid minute of absolute silence. Then it stopped. I deleted it without thinking. I kind of wish I hadn't. I don't know what it meant or how it got there. I haven't gone back to that trail. I still camp sometimes, but only in groups, and I don't use that tent anymore. I gave it to Goodwill a few days later. Not because anything was wrong with it, but because it still smelled faintly like something unfamiliar. Not dirt, not sweat, not plastic. Something colder. Sterile, almost. I've tried to write it off. Maybe I sleepwalked. Maybe I had a weird dream and thrashed around and dragged all my gear in without realizing. But that light, that silence, not being able to hear my own breath, that wasn't a dream. I was awake for that part. I know I was. I was driving west on Highway 62, cutting through the Mojave, heading back toward 29 Palms after visiting a friend in Parker. It was late summer, hot even with the sun going down, and I had the windows cracked because the air conditioner in my truck barely worked. The desert has this strange way of holding on to heat, like the ground itself radiates it back at you long after the sun dips. Around the time I hit the stretch past Rice, I noticed something in the side mirror. At first, I thought it was just a bright star, maybe Venus, because it was low on the horizon and looked steady. But as I kept glancing, I realized it didn't move the way it should. Every curve, every straightaway, the thing stayed in the same position relative to my truck. Always just over my left shoulder, glowing steady, almost white. I tried not to obsess over it. I turned up the radio, kept my eyes on the road, told myself it was just my brain locking onto a bright planet while I was driving long distance. But every time I checked the mirror, it was still there. The weird part was that nothing else was in the sky. The dusk had this pale, flat light. No stars yet, just a faint orange line where the sun had been. Everything else was washed out blue. This one point of light looked out of place, like it had no business being there. After about 20 miles, I started testing it. I slowed down, sped up, even swerved slightly within my lane. The light didn't change. I'd crest a hill and dip into a low stretch, and I'd still see it, same spot, steady as if it was tethered to me. That's when I decided to pull over. There's not much out there but gravel shoulders and creosote bushes. I eased the truck off the road, gravel crunching under my tires, and threw it into park. My first thought was maybe it would slide past, like it had been coincidentally aligned all that time. But when I stepped out and shut the door, the desert was silent and the light was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. I leaned against the side of the truck, staring up. The heat coming off the asphalt made the air shimmer, but the light cut right through it. White, steady, sharp, too steady. I cupped a hand over my eyes like that would help and tried to gauge if it was closer than a star should be. I couldn't tell. There were no clouds, no frame of reference, just open desert. But something about it felt near, like I could sense the distance shrinking if I focused too hard. The longer I stood there, the quieter it felt. Normally you'd hear at least a cricket or two, maybe the faint hiss of wind through the brush. But there was nothing. Just the ticking sound of my truck cooling down and my own breathing. After maybe a minute, I got this sudden urge to get back in the truck. I can't explain it better than that. Like standing out there under that light was wrong. So I climbed back inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. The second I pulled back onto the highway, I checked the mirror again. Still there. Perfectly in line with me, like it had been waiting. I drove faster, trying to put distance between myself and the feeling of being watched. I didn't look at the mirror for a while, but every time I finally glanced, it was there, holding its place. About 10 miles later, I saw another car coming toward me, a pair of headlights cresting a hill. As it passed, I glanced back at the mirror. For the first time, the light seemed to shift. Not much, just a tiny flicker like it had been disturbed. When the other car's taillights disappeared in the distance, it snapped right back into its spot. That was the point where my stomach really dropped. I pulled over again, more abrupt this time, gravel spraying. I shut off the headlights, killed the engine, and just sat there in the dark. The desert swallowed the sound quick, like it always does out there. The light hovered, steady, same as before. I rolled the window down and stuck my head out, craning my neck to look up at the glass between us. Still the same. No sound, no movement, no flicker. I don't know how long I sat there. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Long enough for the sky to darken more, long enough for other stars to finally start showing. That's what unsettled me even more. As the stars appeared one by one, they all twinkled faintly, shifting with the atmosphere, except for that one. It didn't change at all. Eventually, I turned the key again, headlights washing over the brush, and pulled back onto the road. I didn't even want to look at the mirror anymore, but I couldn't stop myself. Each time I did, it was waiting, locked in place. By the time I hit the outskirts of 29 Palms, the town lights started to bleed into the sky. Street lamps, gas stations, neon signs, it all glowed hazy against the dark. I checked the mirror one last time, and the light was gone. Not faded, not drifted away, just gone. I pulled into my driveway shaking, headlights bouncing off my garage door. When I stepped out, I scanned the sky again, searching for it. All I saw were regular stars, scattered like they should be, all of them blinking faintly in the desert haze. Boiling kettle in my head or not, I know what I saw out there. A light that shouldn't have been there. A light that moved when I moved. And a silence in the desert that felt too deep to be natural. I was checking trail cameras in Dead Horse Canyon, up near the northern range, where the forest thins into dry, brushy hills. I volunteer for a wildlife monitoring group that keeps tabs on cougar and bobcat movements, mostly through motion-activated cams we've bolted to trees along old service roads and game trails. It's quiet work. I like that about it. That morning was hot, dry, late July. I'd parked off Forest Road 19 around 6:30 a.m. and started the hike up to the ridge. No wind, no clouds, just the buzz of insects and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The trail cameras were spaced about a mile apart, each tucked in a tree notch or zip-tied to a post. I had 4 to check that morning. First 2 were normal. Just a few deer, 1 coyote, a fox. Third one had a blown battery, so I replaced it and moved on. The last one was positioned overlooking a narrow draw where we'd found mountain lion prints last spring. It's tucked between 2 tall ponderosa pines, angled down a slope toward a low clearing. When I popped the SD card into my tablet, I noticed the last recording was from 2 nights ago. Around 2:17 a.m., The video showed the usual nighttime grain, branches swaying in infrared, a faint animal noise in the background. Then the treetops started lighting up, like moonlight, but brighter, whiter. The camera auto-adjusted, struggling to focus. At the top of the frame, just above the trees, something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, just this dark, egg-shaped blur, hovering maybe 10 or 15 feet above the canopy. No lights, no movement. It didn't drift or wobble like a drone. It just hung there. After maybe 6 seconds, it rose slowly and went out of frame. That was it. No animals showed up after that. The camera didn't record anything else the rest of the night. I watched the clip 3 times in a row, squinting at the shape, trying to convince myself it was a bug on the lens or a trick of light. But I've been reviewing trail footage for 5 years. I've seen bugs, bats, fog, snow, smoke. This wasn't any of those. I hiked back down, loaded the gear into my truck, and drove out to the ranger station just outside Wilson Creek. It's a small concrete building next to the fire lookout garage. Not usually staffed in the mornings, but I know Mike, the district ranger, and figured I could drop off the footage and ask him to review it when he was free. But when I got there, someone else was already inside. There was a black SUV parked next to the shed. No plates. I remember that because I almost backed into it pulling in, and when I looked to see if anyone was inside, the windows were tinted pitch black. The front door to the station was propped open, which is weird for Mike. He's strict about the AC and bugs. I stepped in and froze in the doorway. A man I didn't recognize was standing behind Mike's desk, going through a pile of printer paper. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a black suit, black tie, black dress shoes. No ranger badge, no patch. His hair was dark and slicked back, and his skin looked almost gray. Not pale, just slightly off, like he'd been in fluorescent lighting too long. He turned as I stepped in. His face didn't show any surprise, just this blank kind of interest, like a cashier waiting for you to speak. I said, "Is Mike around?" The man nodded once and said, "He's off-site." Then he gestured at the printouts on the desk. "You're with the Wildlife Survey, correct?" I didn't answer right away. He picked up one of the pages and held it out. It was a black and white thermal still, one of mine, from a week ago, showing a herd of elk crossing a creek. I hadn't uploaded that one to the shared drive yet. I asked, "Who are you with?" He smiled, just barely. "We work parallel to your department. You don't need to be concerned." His voice was flat, low, like he was suppressing an accent. Not robotic, exactly, just weirdly controlled, like each word was measured before he said it. He put the photo down and added, "We've reviewed your recent capture from Unit D4. That was the camera I just hiked to. I hadn't uploaded that footage yet, either. I didn't say anything. I just stood there while he walked over to a side table, picked up a manila folder, and handed it to me. Inside were several grainy printouts, stills from my video, the treetops, the shape above them, the light. He said, "We'll ask that you redirect your research efforts away from the upper ridge for the remainder of the season." That's how he said it. Redirect your research efforts. I asked if something was going on up there. He just looked at me for a moment, then said, "If you've seen anything unusual, we recommend you do not share those details outside of your team." I told him we're a volunteer group. There isn't really a team. He didn't respond. I left the folder on the desk and walked out. I didn't see the SUV drive off, but when I looked back 5 minutes later from the parking area, it was gone. Later that afternoon, I tried to upload the clip to our shared drive and my tablet crashed. Not just the video app, the whole system went dark. It took me 2 hours to get it to restart, and when it finally did, the SD card was blank. No files. I hadn't backed them up yet. I drove back out 2 days later to recheck the camera. When I got there, the unit was missing. Zip ties cut, mounting post gone. No note, no damage to the tree or signs of animals. We rotate cameras all the time, but no one from my group had been up there. When I emailed Mike asking who had access to the station that morning, he replied, "I was on fire watch all week. Nobody had my keys." I haven't brought it up again. Every now and then, I still drive past the canyon trailhead and think about hiking up there, but I never do. The last time I went near that slope, I swear I heard something above the trees. Not loud, just a soft mechanical hum, like electricity in the air. I didn't look up. I was up on Eagle Ridge right after midnight, hunched over my telescope eyepiece. I'd driven my old Jeep up the service road at dusk, parked next to the weathered plywood shack I'd built last summer, and hauled in my Celestron 8-inch on its Dobsonian mount. The air was cool, just warm enough that I didn't need a heavy coat. The sky was clear, no moon, only a handful of planets and thousands of stars. I had my eye on one in particular, an unremarkable point in Cygnus I'd been tracking for months. Amateur catalogs called it blink star, because when you increased magnification past 200 times, it would wink out for a few seconds, then come back. I'd attributed it to atmospheric ripple or an equipment glitch. But tonight felt different. I set the eyepiece to 250 Ks, focused until the star was pinprick sharp, and watched. In the first minute, it blinked 3 times. Nothing unusual there. I'd seen it do that before. Then, around 12:13 a.m., I glanced at my phone clock and the star blinked out. I waited. 20 seconds later, it reappeared. I jotted down the interval in my notebook. 20.4 seconds. I reset the scope to 300 times. Blink, blink, back. But then, after the third reappearance, the eyepiece went black for a full minute. I checked the lens cap. Off. I swapped eyepieces. Still black. My pulse sped up. I leaned back and peered through the finder scope. Perfect sky, every star in place, except nothing where blink stars should be. The area was empty. I checked the main mount's power cable. Plugged. The red LED on the mount's control box blinked slowly. I pressed the override button. The computers flickered, the motors whirred. The star field returned, but no blink star. Not in the eyepiece, not in the finder. I rummaged in my bag for the smartphone adapter, attached it, and took a quick photo. The image processed, tiny stars like diamonds on black velvet, but still no star in that spot. I rubbed my eyes, checked the phone's timestamp, 12:17 a.m. When I looked up with my own eyes, a dim light hovered behind the ridge across the valley. Nothing like the blinking star, just a soft glow, orange against the pines. At first I thought it was headlights, maybe some late-night hunter or hiker's lantern, but the glow didn't move. It stayed for 5 minutes, then faded. I recorded the moment in my notebook. Then I noticed something else. My watch was 2 minutes slow. I always synced it to phone time before I left. I checked my phone, still reading 12:19. I pressed refresh on the NTP server app, no connection. Cell service was dead. I grabbed my handheld ham radio, new battery last week, and keyed the mic. This is Alpha Sierra November. Does anyone copy? Static. I waited. Nothing. I tried again, louder. No voice answered. I tried the lower power repeater channel. Dead. By then my fingers were numb. I poked at my phone. Camera, weather app, compass. Everything was frozen. I tapped the screen. The home button only vibrated. Finally, I held power until it rebooted. The clock reset to 12:20 a.m. I opened the camera roll. My blink star photos from earlier were gone. No images at all. The gallery only held a selfie I'd taken at sundown. I leaned against the tripod, heart pounding. The ridge light hadn't returned. The sky still glittered untouched. I unhooked the telescope's power cable, kicked in the manual mode, and aimed it by hand at the coordinates I'd recorded. The mount groaned. The star field looked right, but the star was missing again. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. On impulse, I checked my truck's clock, 11:17. Even that was a full hour off. I shook my head, tried to piece things together, and realized I'd been up here since 7 p.m., maybe longer, but I couldn't trust any time reference. I decided to pack up and head down. I turned off the mount's motors and swung the scope around to the cabin door for storage, but snagged halfway and refused to budge. I tugged harder. The mount hummed as if powered, though it wasn't. With a final jerk, it released and slammed against the plywood. The eyepiece shattered. I yanked the mount's power cord. Silence. The valley was still. No ridge glow, no radio static, no blinking star. By the time I loaded the broken telescope in the back of the Jeep, the sky had begun to pale. I glanced up. Cygnus was gone, replaced by pre-dawn haze. I drove down the gravel road with headlights on low beam, unsure where every turn was. I keyed my phone's GPS. No signal. I switched to offline maps. Still no path visible. I took the wrong fork twice, finally found the main road by sheer luck, and headed home. When I got to my driveway, it was 6:02 a.m. on the dashboard clock, matching the sunrise. I shut off the engine and sat there breathing hard. The eyepiece shards were in a paper bag on the passenger seat. My notebook was in the glove box, open to scribbled times and intervals and one note. Ridge light, glow lasted 5 minutes. Inside, the house was quiet. My phone finally got service. 8 missed calls from my brother and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. I called him back. He said he'd texted, asking about dinner. I apologized. He said that was weird because I'd answered his first call at 7 a.m. I told him I was fine. I checked my inbox. No texts from that unknown number. No voicemail. The photos I'd managed to save were still in my camera's memory card. Shaky shots of the star and flickers of darkness. But every timestamp said the files all named img.jpg. I dropped the eyepiece into my desk drawer, shut the drawer, and rubbed my eyes. I glanced at the clock. 6:35 a.m. Too early to go back to bed. Later that day, I drove up to the observatory to download the mount's logs. Maybe they recorded power surges or firmware errors. But the control box was gone, wrenched off its shelf with rough gouges in the plywood walls. The mount itself was missing. Only jagged metal shavings on the floor marked where it had been. I walked back through the woods in the afternoon light. The ridge was still and empty. No hunters, no lights, no signs of equipment. Just trees and rocks. I still look up at the stars every night, but I don't go back to Eagle Ridge. Once in a while, I catch a glimpse of a dim point in Cygnus that twitches, but I don't linger. I tell friends I lost interest in Blink Star. I tell myself that makes sense. And I swear sometimes in the darkest hour before dawn, I hear the soft hum of a mount's motors spinning into place, but there's nothing there but empty sky. I was wiping down the counter at Black Rock Cafe just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Outside, the sky over the old quarry was bruised purple, just the way people said they saw weird lights there. I'd heard it all night. Flash stories, rumors of glowing orbs bouncing off the limestone walls. None of it mattered to me until a customer who called himself John leaned in and said, "You ever see anything up at Miller's Pit? Last night I was driving home and these orange spheres just hovered over the blasted rock face. No sound, just they hovered and then they blinked out." I nodded and poured his espresso, half listening, half focused on the milk steaming too hot. He kept talking. 15 feet wide at least. I wanted to get out and get a photo, but as soon as I hit record, it flickered, like it didn't want to be on camera. He shrugged as he sipped. Maybe I was seeing things. He tipped back in his chair, staring at the empty road beyond the window. I was about to ask more, figured I'd heard the story before, when the door chimed. In walked a man in a black suit, no tie, crisp white shirt, shoes polished enough to reflect the neon cafe sign. He paused in the threshold, scanning the room like someone doing a head count, but he didn't meet my eyes. He didn't order anything. Instead, he walked straight to the table where John sat and slipped into the booth opposite him. The cafe was practically empty, just me, John, and one other regular zoned out over a latte, and when the stranger sat down, the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dull. John froze, mid-sip, his brow furrowed. He set the cup down and said, "Can I help you?" The man just stared, hands flat on the table, shoulders locked. He didn't nod or glance at the menu board. After a long beat, he said in a quiet, even tone, "Tell me about the lights." That was it. No apology, no hello. He didn't flash any ID or business card. John swallowed and said, I was just talking about them. I saw lights, orange, hovering." The man leaned forward a fraction and asked, "Where exactly?" He spoke like a machine, each word deliberate. John rattled off the back roads, naming gravel cutoffs and abandoned cabins. The man didn't take notes. He just nodded once and sat back, expressionless. I cleared the counter, heart thumping. Every few seconds I glanced over, half expecting the stranger to dissolve into mist like one of those alleged orbs. But he stayed there, watching John. Not leaning in, not scribbling, just sitting perfectly still. When John finished his cup, he pushed back his chair, said, "I've got to go." The man didn't move. John's eyes flicked to me, and he gave a small wave like he needed me to acknowledge something about the guy. I nodded, dropped the tip jar into the register, wiped my palms on my apron, and watched John stand. The man in black said, "Be safe." His voice was too flat for comfort, like a robot trying sincerity. John hesitated, then hurried out without looking back. He sent me a text 2 minutes later. He's still sitting there. I looked. Empty booth. The suit was gone. No one else in the cafe, just a faint scent of cinnamon and espresso. I locked the register and turned off the neon sign as the other regular left. The door latched behind me with a final click. My hands shook as I flipped the closed sign over. I walked out to the parking lot under that bruised sky, half expecting the man to be leaning against the passenger side of my car, but there was nothing. Just John's Prius at the curb, wrapped in fog. I got in my beat-up sedan and drove home on Route 47, windows down, despite the chill. The quarry lay on my right, silent and dark except for the distant glow of a single street lamp. I fought the urge to turn into the gravel access road, even though I knew better than to chase a ghost story in the dark. At home, I set my keys on the hallway table and flicked on every light. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no unknown texts. The only message was John's. I stared at it, wondering if maybe he'd gone back to be watched again. I booted up my laptop to play some music, but the quiet click of the fan sounded too loud, too mechanical. I reached for the phone to text him back, "You okay?" But stopped. What could I say? I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward. Outside, soft headlights passed on the street. I thought I saw a dark shape at the window. No, just the neighbor's cat. My heart eased slightly. I opened my laptop and pulled up the local news site. Nothing unusual. Municipal meetings, a story about a high school band, someone's missing cat. No mentions of lights or suits or secret meetings in coffee shops. Sleep didn't come easy. I checked the alarm clock at 1:03 a.m., then again at 1:19. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps on gravel. I lay awake until 3:30, half expecting a knock on the door. Morning light felt weak and pale. I brewed coffee and stared out the window at the empty street. I considered calling John. Maybe he'd seen the man again, maybe he'd had his lights flicker back on, but I didn't call. I just poured the coffee, adding too much cream so it tasted sweet. I left the house at 7:15 for my shift, same route past the quarry. Headlights cut like knives through the mist. Pine trees loomed on either side. No glow, no sign of anyone standing by the cut line. I parked at the cafe lot and braced myself before stepping inside. The door chime rang. I set down my keys and forced a smile for the morning rush. A few regulars sat at the counter, but no suits, no staring. The neon sign hummed back to life. I wiped the bar top and wondered if the man was still out there, somewhere in the fog, taking notes, waiting for another sighting. I handed a cappuccino to a customer named Marisol and leaned against the edge of the counter. She said, "You okay? You look tired." I shrugged. "Long night." She nodded and sipped her drink. I glanced at the empty booth where John and the stranger had sat. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck like someone was watching from outside. I looked through the window, just mist and cones of streetlight. I turned back and tossed my cloth into the rag bin. The espresso machine hissed. I dropped a puck into the knockbox and reached for beans for the next grinder. The lights overhead felt too bright, too harsh. I thought about closing early, but I put on a soundtrack of mellow jazz instead. Lunch came and went. No one asked about the quarry lights. No one mentioned a man in a suit. It was like last night hadn't happened, or like everyone agreed not to ask. By evening, the quarry had faded into memory. I locked up at 9:15, set the alarm, and walked to my car. The sky was clear, the stars steady points of light. As I drove away, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark eyes, pale face, a question left hanging. I didn't look back. I kept going, headlights on, fog behind me fading, waiting for something new to blur the line between what I'd seen and what I'd been told. I heard the door chime at exactly 11:02 p.m., but when I looked up from the counter, I saw no one walking in, just the empty double doors and the dull hum of the neon open sign. I glanced at the clock behind me, 11:02, and then back out the front window. A black sedan sat under the lone street lamp, headlights off, engine idling so quietly I barely heard it over the air conditioner. I was 7 hours into my night shift at Green's 24-hour mini-mart, and I'd never seen that car before. I folded my arms and pretended not to notice. The clerk before me said, "Can I help you?" But he was wrong place, wrong time. The sedan stayed there, broad at the shoulders and low to the ground, like someone had rubbed polish over the entire body. In overnights, you get ghosts, drunk drivers, college kids looking for snacks, but almost never someone who just sits there for hours. By midnight, I'd rung up exactly 12 customers, a mix of kids buying Red Bulls and one guy buying dog biscuits at 3 a.m., and the sedan never moved. I counted how many cigarettes I'd sold. 35. I refilled the snack rack and gazed out the window. No lights moved in the lot except for the single filament bulb overhead, ticking like a slow clock. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Even Scout, the store cat, hunkered down behind the chips aisle, tail wrapped around her paws. At 1:17, my soda cooler buzzed and flickered off for 2 seconds. The power surge was small, enough that my fluorescent lights dimmed, but the coffee machine kept running. That convinced me it wasn't the whole block, just the store's wiring. I muttered to myself and went to reset the breaker in the back room. When I opened the fuse box, the breaker for aisle 3 had tripped. I flipped it back and watched the lights return. Back at the counter, I considered calling my manager, but figured I'd mention it tomorrow. At 2:45, a drip started in the ceiling by the back door. Water, cold and clear, landing in a small puddle on the concrete floor. I grabbed a mop and bucket, found the leak right under the air duct. I inspected the duct. No condensation, no dropped pipe. The drip slowed after 5 minutes, then stopped. I emptied the bucket outside. The lot was empty, the sedan gone. I figured maybe the driver stopped nodding off. The air smelled musty now, like wet carpet. I circled back inside. Scout rushed out from under the counter, rubbing my leg. The drip hadn't woken anyone. I checked the restrooms, dry. I shrugged and grabbed a coffee. By 3:30, the store was quiet again. The bug zapper over the door sizzled twice. A chill cut through the store even though the AC was set on cool. I shivered and pulled my hoodie tighter. That's when I noticed the sedan rolling forward 3 feet. No driver's silhouette in the window. The passenger door opened, but no one stepped out. The door closed on its own and the car rolled back, unchanged, as if on invisible tracks. That was enough. I walked to the front doors, aimed my flashlight at the vehicle. No one inside. No movement. The engine was off now, and the thick tires blocked any sound of it starting again. I went back to the counter, rubbed my eyes, and stared at the security monitors. None of the cameras covered the parking lot well. The angle missed the driver's seat. I hit the view back lot button, tried to pan the camera, but the feed cut to static, then returned to normal after 4 seconds. The only thing frozen in pixelated gray was the front of the black sedan. I stared at the screen until the static cleared. The car remained unchanged. I pressed the record button. The feed continued, no glitches. By 4:50, I'd had one more customer, a young woman buying trail mix. She stared at me, then at the lot, and said, "Is something out there?" I said no, just an old car. She nodded and left. When the doors closed, I checked again. The sedan's roof was empty. I clocked over to the break room at 5:30 and opened the refrigerator. My sandwich was gone. I'd left turkey and cheese, but someone else had taken it. No note, no wrapper in the wastebasket. Just empty plastic. I thought maybe the night janitor had come in early, but I hadn't heard anyone. My shift ended at 6 a.m. The sky was already staining gray. I counted down the minutes, ringing up 2 more people who paid cash for lottery tickets and beef jerky. At 6:02, I hit the button to open the doors. The chime sounded, and I grabbed my jacket. I walked out to the lot, expecting the sedan to still sit there, mocking me. But the lot was empty. No car, no footprints in the gravel, no oil spots. I checked the side door exit. It was locked and no one had tried to pry it. My phone buzzed. A text from the manager saying, "Leave the key under the mat tonight. Maintenance at 10. I hadn't told her the fridge thing, hadn't mentioned the car, nothing. I answered, "Got it." I walked to my car, keys in hand, and stopped. A black SUV sat idling in front of the convenience store across the road. A man in a black suit sat in the driver's seat. Jacket buttoned, tie narrow, hands flat on the wheel. He stared at me without blinking. My pulse spiked. I raised a hand in greeting. He opened his door and stepped onto the street without a sound. I walked closer, keeping my jacket zipped. The morning was cool under my breath. He said, "You won't remember this conversation." His voice was low but clear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pressed a small card into my palm. I saw the edges, white, blank, and in the corner a single line of type, "Do not recall." I blinked. He stepped back, got into the SUV, and drove away without headlights, tires rolling silent on asphalt. I stood there holding the card. When I looked down, the text was gone. My hand was empty. I glanced across the road. The store's doors were closed, lights still on inside. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. I was alone on the skiff because I liked the quiet that comes after dark. Out past the breakwater, the harbor light looked small, and the town behind it was just a soft smear of sodium lamps. I'd left the dock around 10, baited a few lines, and let the boat drift where the current wanted it. It was late August, warm without the day's stickiness, and the sky was the kind that felt like someone had stretched velvet over the world. Stars were sharp as pins. My name's Jonah Mercer. I fish for stripers mostly, part-time, and I know that stretch of water like the back of my hand. That night, everything felt normal at first. The lick of a small wake against the hull, the smell of salt and old bait, the lullaby of a harbor buoy clicking somewhere back toward the shore. Every so often, a fish would slap the surface and the ripples would feather out in the dark. Then the noise fell away. It happened so gradually I almost missed it. 1 second there was the usual background of distant engines and a gull calling to someone on shore. The next, those sounds were gone, cut clean off like someone had put the world on mute. The gull's cry stopped mid-echo and didn't resume. The harbor buoy kept clicking, but it seemed farther, as if sound had been stretched thin and pulled away from me. That made my neck prick. I turned the radio dial by habit, more for company than anything. Static filled the speaker for a second, then a single low tone like a note from a cello hummed under the hiss. No voices, no stations. I thumbed the power off and the hiss stayed, faint, as if the static had moved into the air itself. I had to lean over the side to remind myself the water was there because the surface looked unnaturally flat, like black glass. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the horizon. Nothing. No lights, no other boats, just the black curve of the distant tree line and the scattered spots of town behind it. Even the usual sky traffic seemed thin. I told myself I was being dramatic, the radio's oddness, the silence. It was probably a squall somewhere packing the sound down. I'd been up early that morning, had a long day, cadence of the brain getting jumpy. I told myself to settle in. So I did. I checked the lines, adjusted the drift, and sat back against the outboard cover. My watch read 10:05. I could feel the salt cool on the back of my neck. Then a streak cut across the sky, like someone had thrown a bright cigarette from some high place and it caught as it fell. At first it behaved like a meteor, fast, white, and impossibly bright against the dark. It left that long white tail I'd seen a dozen times in summers. I pointed the binoculars without thinking. The streak was coming down toward the water somewhere off my starboard bow, and a thrill ran through me. Shooting stars were good luck, old fisher superstitions, cheap things to believe in, to pass the night. But then it did something I had never seen before. The streak stopped, not slowed, not burned out. It halted mid-fall and hung in the sky like someone had hit pause. It was maybe 30 degrees above the horizon by my guess, a handful of degrees to my right. Through the binoculars, it was a compact pin of white, steady and intense. No tail, no fanning dust, just a shard of light holding its place. My first reaction was that I was seeing after images, some fatigue of the eye. I blinked hard, the light stayed. I tightened my grip on the glass and watched it. There was no sound from it, no crack, no sizzle of air. The only thing that registered was the way the light seemed to be waiting, like it had been aiming for someplace and paused to check the coordinates. I turned the outboard off then, letting the skiff drift with nothing but current. The silence felt thicker. The radio static flared and then dropped to that low cello note again. I reached for my phone in my dry bag, no bars as usual out there, and angled it to film. The screen showed a black horizon and dots for distant lights, and in the upper right, a bright white pixel that matched the light with ridiculous clarity. I filmed for maybe 10 seconds and kept the binoculars at my eyes. Without warning, it moved. Not down now, but in a quick, jerking zig, like someone dragging the cursor of a video and snapping it at odd angles. Right, left, down a hair, a sharp up. Each change was violent enough to send a small flinch through me, but there was no sound and no wake on the water where it seemed to pass. The motion was unnatural, angular, with no curve like a bird or aircraft would make. It darted in a pattern that didn't feel random. Short, straight shots, small pauses, then another bite of speed. The light's path kept it within sight for a long time because it wasn't falling anymore. It was pacing a little, zigging around as if trying to map something in the dark sea below. At one point it dipped lower, closer to the water, and I felt that old animal reflex where the world narrows and your hands want to move. I leaned forward, heart thudding, and the light slowed, hovered as if deciding, then snapped upward in a clean line. It hung, perfectly still, for maybe 5 beats of my heart. Being that close and that bright, it made the scuppers on the boat glitter white for the fraction of a second. I could see detail through the binoculars, if detail is the right word for a clean white point. There was no edge, no glow, just density of light. My brain tried to make sense of it like it would a headlight or a flare, but it read wrong. It didn't flare or fade. It held. Then, in a motion so quick I almost missed the start, it shot off. Not a slingshot curve or a ballistic arc, just a flat, impossible acceleration straight across the sky until it was gone, a smudge, and then nothing. No contrail, no residual streak. The spot where it had been one heartbeat was simply empty. When it vanished, the sounds crept back in like water flooding a dry room. A distant motor hummed, someone laughed across the harbor, a gull started up and circled lazily, searching for an easier perch. The radio static cut out like a switch. My phone showed the recording I'd taken, and in the last frames, the light's abrupt departure looked like a camera glitch. 1 second on, the next black sky. But I had felt it, the angular moves, the pause, the impossible sprint. That feeling hadn't left. I sat for a long time after, until the salt dried in stiff lines on my hands and my legs started to ache from the cramped position. I ran through explanations: satellite re-entry, improbable debris, a military training flare. I tested each against what I'd watched, and they didn't fit. The zigzags were wrong for anything under normal flight control, wrong for anything subject to gravity in the way a meteor is. There was no sound, no heat signature I could perceive, just a white precision in motion. When I finally started the motor and headed back to the harbor, the town seemed softer somehow, muffled by distance. People on the shore were wrapped in blankets, pointing up at me like I'd been looking at the sky too. But their faces had that small, skeptical smile people wear when a bonfire story gets to the punchline. At the dock, the light of the fish house was on and a few men were unloading a late catch. I tied up, sliding the painter over the post, and my hands were steady enough this time to work. I told them what I'd seen. There are fishermen who trade in stories like weather. They measure truth in whether the story costs them business or gains them mates. I could hear the normal lines, probably a plane, satellites, you get tired out there, and some furrowed brows, some short, practiced skepticism. Old Pete, who'd launched boats when I was a kid, just scratched his chin and said, "You ever see one again, tell me?" I didn't sleep much that night. I cleaned gear until my fingers hurt because action makes the head stop leaning toward the thing it doesn't know. I rode my bike home as dawn smeared pale on the horizon and the sky was ordinary and blue, gulls at the harbor squawking like they'd never stopped. The recording on my phone looped that bright pixel and then the dark. It was ambiguous and fragile, which made it more dangerous. Over the next few days, I kept checking the forecast, scanning the sky, looking for anything angular and patient. Folks I told smiled and stepped around it like a curb. I'd catch myself scanning the waterline at night, expecting the same cold pause of silence, but it never came back. The harbor sounded normal now. The buoy clicked in predictable rhythm. The memory of the way that light hauled itself sideways and then split the darkness with impossible speed is still there in my chest, an itch that won't settle. I went back out a couple times after, salt in the nostrils, lines in the water. The ocean is good at forgiving you, and it keeps its own counsel. I anchored and stared where it had been and tried to look like I was doing it for the fish. The more I tried to pin the night down, the more slippery it became. One precise white point, how it hung, how it jerked, and then how it left in a single clean motion. I was home by dawn each time, and by then, the world had rearranged itself into routine. Coffee, the count of bait in the box, the small talk in the harbor. What I know is what I saw and how my skin tightened when it did those faceted turns. I know the silence that fell before it and the way ordinary sound reopened afterward. I know I came home alive, tied the boat, and went inside, and that the town's morning business rolled right on as if night hadn't been interrupted. I don't have an explanation, only the memory of a star that stopped mid-fall, arranged itself like some small careful machine, and then left as if it had better places to be. I was finishing my last delivery for the night, the kind where everything's quiet, except the hum of the van's engine and the faint buzz of neon signs in the distance. It was just past 11 p.m., and the streets of Cedar Ridge were empty, the kind of empty that makes you notice every little sound, a dog barking 3 blocks away, the scrape of a loose shutter in the wind. I'd done this route enough times that I knew every turn and shortcut without thinking. I pulled into the lot for the last house, an older duplex with peeling paint and a single dim porch light. The van's headlights washed over the driveway, and as I cut the engine, every other exterior light on the street, lamps on poles, security lights, a few from the houses themselves, flickered once in unison. Just a quick dip and back on. I blinked. I muttered something under my breath. Great, power surge or something. But as I stepped out, I noticed it, a soft hum in the air. Not mechanical, not from my van, nothing I could place. It wasn't loud, just low enough that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced up, thinking maybe one of the streetlights had been oscillating strangely, or some transformer down the block was acting up. That's when I saw it. A dim, oval-shaped glow hovered over the trees at the end of the street. Pale, bluish-white, just enough light to make it visible through the thin mist that had rolled in overnight. It moved slowly, almost lazily, in a way that made no sense. It wasn't following the road. It wasn't stationary. It just drifted above the tree line, calm, deliberate. I froze, my hands gripping the package I was supposed to deliver. The hum grew a fraction louder, almost imperceptibly, like the air itself had thickened around me. My brain tried to rationalize. A drone? But I hadn't seen anything like it. No blinking lights, no shape. It was a glow, smooth, uniform, not mechanical. I stepped back toward the van, heart racing, and the glow tilted slightly, moving along the street at a pace that felt off. I squinted, and it seemed to pause whenever I blinked or shifted my gaze. The hum never stopped. I reached for my phone to grab a picture, and the glow dimmed as if sensing the motion. It wasn't gone entirely, but it faded just enough that my camera couldn't pick it up properly. I lowered the phone and watched as it drifted toward the far edge of the trees and vanished completely. No fade into the sky, no movement behind the clouds, just gone. I stood there for a long moment, the hum gone, the lights normal, the street entirely silent again. My hands were trembling, and I realized I hadn't even breathed for a while. Shaking, I got back into the van. The engine started smoothly, no hiccups, no interference, nothing that suggested anything abnormal had occurred except for my own nerves. I drove slowly down the street, glancing up at the tree line again. Nothing. Every house was dark, every lamp steady. The neighborhood was ordinary again. On the way back to the depot, my mind replayed the event over and over. The synchronization of the lights, the hum, the slow drift of that glow, it all made sense in no logical way. I thought about stopping at a gas station to tell someone, anyone, but I realized there'd be no evidence. No trail, no video, no drone or drone pilot to question. Just me. I kept thinking I'd missed something. Maybe there was a plane behind the clouds? No, too slow, too deliberate. A weather balloon? Could be. Except of all the nights I've driven these streets, I'd never seen one behave like that, and the glow didn't move with the wind. By the time I reached the depot, the sun was starting to push light across the horizon. The event was hours ago in real time, but it felt like it had stretched out, moments dragging one after another. I parked the van, took a deep breath, and tried to shake it off. Later, I told my supervisor, half laughing, trying to sound casual. He nodded, said maybe a transformer or a low cloud catching city lights. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to. But I could still feel it, the hum vibrating faintly in my chest like an echo left behind by something that shouldn't exist. That night, on the drive home, I found myself looking up at the sky more than the road. Every flicker of light in the distance made me check instinctively. Every shadow along the tree line made me tense. I didn't see the glow again, but I could feel the memory of it, the way it hovered silently, completely indifferent to me or my van. I parked at home and sat in the driveway for a while. The neighborhood was quiet. normal. No hum, no flickering lights, no pale glow drifting across the sky. I finally got out, leaned against the van, and let the cold air settle on me. I couldn't explain it. Nothing about it fit with anything I knew. And yet, it happened. I've made deliveries in that area dozens of times before and since. I've seen fog, power blips, strange reflections, you name it, none of them compare. Every time the night is still, I find myself glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see that soft oval of light drifting slowly, moving in ways that no earthly thing should. I don't tell anyone else about it anymore. You can't. People would laugh or shake their heads. But I remember every flicker of lights, every soft hum, every impossibly slow drift of that glow. It was real, in a way that doesn't fit into the world we think we know, and the quiet that followed it, that, I think, haunts me more than the glow itself. I pulled into the Dust Devil Diner around midnight because I needed coffee and a quiet booth more than I needed the motel 3 miles down the road. The lot was half full, local rigs and a couple of sedans that looked like people had been there long enough to sleep in the chairs. The sky was pure, desert black with a sharp band of stars near the horizon. It was one of those nights that felt like it belonged to the road. Clear, cold after sunset. Silence pressed thin. Inside, the neon over the counter buzzed that lazy hum you get with old glass tubes. The sign outside the diner and the motel across the street and the gas station at the corner all threw their colors into the parking lot, giving Chrome a warm fairground look. I sat with my elbows on the formica and ordered coffee, black, and a grilled cheese, comfort food that didn't require any thinking. The first thing that was off was the jukebox. It had been playing something old and scratchy when I walked in, a Patsy Cline record that fit the place. Then the music died mid-verse. The needle hit silent, and there was this little electrical tick. The waitress didn't even glance up. She took my order like nothing happened. The coffee machine gave one long sigh and settled. People went on talking. I thought maybe the jukebox had jammed. I didn't think further about it. I was halfway through my sandwich when the neon signs dimmed. Not a gradual fade like at dawn, but a synchronized dip, like someone had turned a master dimmer. The red of the Dust Devil sign went thin. The motel's letters looked bruised. The gas pump's green halo shuddered. The whole lot lost a third of its light, and it made the chrome of rigs look like they had been painted with a darker silver. It was the sameness of it that pulled at me. Every sign, all the bulbs, blinking lower in the same second. The waitress paused with a pot over the burner like she'd been caught in mid-breath. A trucker at the counter crooked his head and said, "What the?" and then shut up because even his voice sounded loud in the thinning light. Then everything else quieted. The low hum of the diner fridge softened and then stopped. The road noise that usually hummed past the pumps on a night like that went oddly inaudible. No trucks down the highway, no distant tires on hot asphalt. A moth that had been flitting near a lamplight froze against the window for a beat and then dropped to the sill. Small things, ordinary things, rearranged themselves into a pattern that made my mouth go dry. My phone lost signal. The little bars in the corner jumped from 1 to none like an old elevator. The CB in my cab, a habit I check out of reflex, gave me nothing but static when I flipped it on after slipping back into my jacket. The clock over the counter was blinking 12, like a power outage had married it to a microwave. The waitress frowned, then shrugged and wiped the counter as if wiping could take the moment away. I stepped outside because the air felt wrong in my chest. The lot felt empty, even though there were trucks. The desert wind that usually dove across the asphalt and threw gravel at the curb had stopped somewhere out by the highway. The neon was a dull watercolor from across the street, and the chrome on the rig I had parked next to looked like a sculpted boot, dark and patient. The movement came next. It started as a pale smear at the far edge of the lot, near the motel's roped-off sign, and it moved across the asphalt. It wasn't a car, not really. No engine, no headlights, just a slow horizontal wash of light, the color of a moon behind a thin cloud. It drifted. Not fast, not with the precise motion of a drone, but like someone had set a lantern on the wind, and then the wind forgot to blow. When it reached the rigs, it made the chrome breathe. For a moment, the light lay across the hood of my truck and the bars of its grill, like a hand passing over a page. The reflection slid along the cab, a pale stroke that made my name on the door look ghostly. I put my palm on the metal where the light had been and felt only cold and beads of condensation from the night air. No heat, no residue, just that faint, wrong light casting itself and then being gone. The motel sign dimmed again, the same synchronized dip. The waitress stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, her face a map of small surprises. A couple of guys at a corner booth pushed their chairs back. One of them went out to look, leaving his plate half-eaten. He came back in and sat down like he had decided not to tell a story. Silence is a language truckers understand. We catalog little things. We talk about strange stops, about lights over the highway, about coyotes that act wrong, but most of the time we keep whatever list to ourselves. I watched the pale wash go from rig to rig. It didn't touch the ground. It lay across things like a film over an old photograph. When it crossed the chrome on my mirror, it made my eyes ache a little. Not because it was bright, but because it had depth. It looked like someone had taken a shallow bowl of diluted paint and dragged it along the lot, and the brushstroke had a mind of its own. After it passed the last truck, it climbed the motel pole and vanished into the sky. There was a moment, a fraction, maybe two, where the motel sign winked back to normal and the pumps hummed again like a sigh. A flea market neon cross on the far side of the lot blinked entirely off and on as if to reassure itself. The jukebox in the diner flared to life with a metallic pop and started in the middle of a song. The moth on the sill flew away, puzzled. My phone chimed like it had received a dozen messages at once, and the bars in the corner returned. I kept thinking about scale, how far away that light had to be for it to look like a thin wash, and whether anything that size could move so deliberately and silently over an open lot. I thought about filing a report, calling the local PD, putting something official on paper. I didn't. I remember telling myself the next day I'd be rational, that if I put it into words now, it'd sound dumb. So I drank the coffee they refilled for me and ate the second grilled cheese and left a tip in the jar. I climbed back into the cab and sat for a few minutes with the engine running and the heater doing its slow work. My hands didn't stop moving, thumb rubbing over the steering wheel, fingers finding the pockets where spare coins lived. The radio picked up a clear station then, summer-old country music, and the static I'd had earlier cleared like someone had taken a brush to glass. When I pulled out of the lot, the world felt rearranged. The lights along the highway were normal. The horizon was a hard line. The rigs rolled past in their lanes and drivers waved as they do. I rolled west for another 100 miles until dawn bled into the sky and the desert turned from coal to ash to something with color. I stopped at a rest area and slept in the cab for an hour. The kind of sleep where you never really get your breath back. I thought about calling someone afterward, telling a buddy at the yard something that might get me laughed at or at least an eye roll. I thought about it and then I didn't. That evening I put my name on the log, signed for my load, and drove the miles the way I always did. Low gear, steady speed, mind on the road and the road only. There were jokes at the truck stop about phantom lights and desert mirages, stories told loud and loose. People swapped them to keep the long hours bright. I smiled and took a coffee refill. When I finally pulled into my driveway at home, the streetlight by the mailbox was a stubborn single orange. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, the truck cooling with a sigh. My daughter came out with a flashlight to meet me, hair wild from sleep, and she threw her arms around me like I was the whole world. The house smelled of something baking, ordinary and stubborn. I didn't tell her. I told my wife, but only the small parts, a dim, some lights going off. She hummed and said, maybe the county had been doing maintenance. I can kill the story with how reasonable people make reality sound, how a plausible explanation slides into a small space and fills it. I didn't push. I didn't tell the part about the light lying across my grill like a thin hand. I didn't tell the part about the way the jukebox hit a glitch and then came back in mid-song. Every now and then, I drive back out that way when the weather is right, when the sky is spare and the highway is empty and the Dust Devil sign still leans like a patient sentinel. I sit in my rig and wait, because waiting is what you do when something doesn't fit the shelf of normal. Sometimes nothing happens and the lot is just a lot, neon humming and pumps waiting. Sometimes I swear I see the faintest smudge above the motel and then I blink and it's gone. Mostly I chalk it up to the road. It's tricks. It's quiet. Mostly I go on with the regular jobs, emptying trailers, threading miles like beads in a string, calling in loads, hearing my daughter's voice through the receiver. But there are times when I polish the chrome at dusk and the reflection is too clean, and I find my hand pausing where a pale light might brush it. In that pause, the memory isn't an explanation, it's just a motion, like the night reaching out and then drawing back. I moved in on a Wednesday, boxes and cheap pizza boxes and a week's worth of takeout bags, the sort of new place mess you convince yourself will look better in a month. The apartment faced the courtyard, and across from my living room was another window the exact width of mine, the building's 2 windows, like a pair of eyes. I liked the place because it was quiet and cheap, and the landlord fixed things right away. I didn't like the way my across-the-way window kept its blinds cracked open about an inch. It was weird at first because it was so deliberate. Morning, noon, night, that same thin sliver of light. If I sat at my couch and leaned forward, I could see the gap in the Venetian blinds like a little black tongue. Once or twice I thought it was a bad hinge or someone who liked the light that way, but one evening I noticed a tiny metallic glint in the dark slit, a flash that looked like lenses. I started paying attention because that's how stupid fear begins. You look up and keep looking. The glint wasn't every night, but often enough. It showed up when the courtyard light was low, always at the same angle, like someone lifting binoculars and angling them to the spot where my couch sits. The first time I saw it, I told myself I was imagining reflections, a spoon or a phone catching light. The second time I saw it, the skin between my shoulder blades tightened. The person behind the blinds had a rhythm. On weeknights, it would be dark at 11, then the glint at 11:07. On weekends, it was later. I started tracking it like a silly hobby, a tiny sticky note on my TV with times. I'd made coffee and sat in the dark to see if I could catch more. Once I cupped my hands around my mug and watched him lift binoculars, watched the shape of my couch, and I saw how careful he was with the movement, like he didn't want me to know I'd been watched. He never moved the blinds open more. Just that inch was enough for him. A few small things added up. A paper I'd left on the coffee table. Unpacking had left one of those tiny yellow instruction leaflets on top of a box. Would be moved a little the next morning. Not the kind of drift a breeze makes, but a nudge, like from fingertips. My porch light that clicked on at dusk would be off a few minutes later when I checked. A neighbor's cat I sometimes heard rifling through the courtyard would pause outside the glass as if something in the darkness was holding it back. Once, I heard a soft little cough like someone saying something to themselves through a sock pulled over their mouth. I thought about talking to the landlord, but the landlord was great at fixing leaks and not great at dealing with weird people. And I didn't want to make a scene before I had to. Instead, I tried to catch him. One night I left the overhead light on full and sat with my back to the window, fingers trembling. The glint came and he changed his angle like he'd felt it. He lifted and lowered the binoculars once, and then, like a man whose attention had been called, he was gone. The blinds stayed that inch open. It turned into a small, sour panic that settled into my evenings. I stopped doing things that left me with my back to the window. I moved my couch an inch and sat with my lamp where the couch had been so I could see the reflection in the dark glass. I once left my laptop open and walking through a slideshow of bright photos so something would blink on the screen. The binocular glint shifted the next night to the left edge of the slit, as if he was studying the new light. The night I closed my own blinds all the way, I'd been running my hands over boxes and thinking about how stupid it was that my breathing got caught up in the way a stranger held a pair of binoculars. I shut them tight, the pull cord making that soft mechanical noise. The apartment felt more private immediately. Not safe, but private. And I sat with the blinds closed and the TV off, the room heavy with my own breath. Part of me wanted to sleep. Part of me wanted to burn the apartment down and leave the city. 10 minutes later, there was a knock so soft I thought it might be someone dropping something, a polite little tap. Then another. Then quick, impatient raps. Someone's knuckles on the door, deliberate and close. I froze in a way I'd only ever frozen in movies. I knew not to open, but I also knew enough people in my life to say hello at a door. I went to the peephole and looked. A man stood there in a windbreaker, his hood pulled back, hair damp from the drizzle that had started. He wasn't young, not old, maybe late 30s. He smiled like he meant to be friendly, but whatever in his face did, the smiling looked rehearsed. Up close, he had lines at the eyes, the kind people get from watching too much and talking too little. He held a rolled-up paper in one hand. "Evening," he said through the door like he should know me. "We watch out for each other in this building, right?" His voice had the odd, flat timing I'd heard when he mouthed my living room at 11. "You closed your blinds." He tapped the door with his knuckles once like punctuation. I didn't answer. I remembered the landlord's rule about not opening to anyone after dark. I backed away and felt for my phone. The man kept talking in fitful bursts like he was waiting for me to say something. "It's not polite to watch people, but we keep an eye on things. You got new stuff in. Thought you might want to know. Your front door was open earlier." It was a lie. I'd been in the place all afternoon. His eyes skittered for a second like he was referencing a small map only he could see. He shifted, and in the gap between the windbreaker and his wrist, I saw something metallic tucked at his belt. Not a gun, just a small box-shaped thing, maybe a phone or a camera, but it felt like proof that he'd come prepared. I stepped back, palms sweating, and said carefully, "I don't know you." He laughed once, low, like it was the same sound from the night, and said, "You can't blame a guy for being nosy. Everyone's got their habits." The laugh thinned like a thread. Then he tried a different tactic. "Look, if you don't want people to look, don't leave the blinds cracked. That's all I'm saying." The way he said it made the sentence a rule, not a suggestion. Something in me tightened like a wire. I dialed the landlord's number, not thinking of police at first because I'd been trying to keep things small, to keep the building on speaking terms. The man at the door listened like a patient animal and then said, "That's fine. Hope you sleep well." He left without another knock. The hood pulled back up, the rolled paper under his arm. He moved down the hallway with a slow, deliberate pace. I sat on the floor and stared at the door until my phone call with the landlord turned into a message thread. He said he'd send someone up to check the hallway and to not open to anyone without ID. The only person who came up was a building cleaner with a squeaky cart who mumbled that he'd seen the man downstairs and that he lived on the other side. Guy keeps to himself. The cleaner's eyes flicked to the far window and then away. He didn't say binoculars. He didn't have to. I didn't sleep that night. Jenna came over at dawn because she knew I was wired, and we walked the courtyard while the city woke up. The across-window blinds were open that morning, the inch gap back in place, and I could see the thin, dark line of where someone had pressed a lens to the glass. She called the police for me while I stood there and watched the building like I'd been the one on the other side of the slit. They came with patient faces and forms and radios, and they knocked on the across-the-way door, and they asked questions. The man answered, calm and smooth. He said his name was Michael. He said he liked the view. He said he'd noticed me moving boxes and hadn't meant anything by it. He said he was sorry if he'd made me uncomfortable. The officers took the last sentence and the first in the middle and decided they'd do a report. They asked him to stop using binoculars. They told him the law about privacy. He smiled and said he understood. On paper, it looked small. A neighbor complaint, some awkward words, a promise. But the officer also told me I could get a protective order if it got worse, and that I should keep any evidence, photos, timestamps, and to call immediately if he knocked again. One of the officers scribbled down a description and told me they'd patrol the block more often that week. I moved my couch away from that window. I bought blackout curtains and left them closed for a week. I put motion lights on the sill. I bought a camera and set it up pointing across the courtyard. The first night, the glint didn't appear. The second night it did, smaller this time, like someone peeking between blinds to see if I'd notice. 2 weeks later, I saw him in the stairwell when I was leaving for work. He walked past me, carrying a paper grocery bag, and his head turned toward the courtyard like a dog catching a scent. This time, I didn't look away. He met my eyes briefly, and there was no apology there, only the small, hard thing that had been waiting behind the blinds. I changed my locks a month after that. I told the landlord I wanted the window replaced, if possible. I learned routes through the building that kept me out of sight. I slept with the blackout curtain closed and a cheap camera rolling the nights, just in case someone wanted to be sure I was alone. The officers never found anything criminal in the end. Michael didn't come after me, not legally. But some things in life slid into the shape of a threat without ever being labeled one. The blinds stayed the same width for a long time afterward, a stubborn little slit on the other side. I kept my lights low, my curtains pulled, and my phone in my hand a little longer when I walked to the door. When I looked up at that window now, the glint sometimes returned. When it did, I had proof to show and a number to call. That felt small and real, and it felt like the only useful thing to do. I was dozing on the couch, half listening to some crappy true crime podcast I'd fallen asleep to, when I heard the first knock. It was soft, like someone testing the wood, not enough to wake me if I'd been in a deeper sleep. I sat up and looked at the clock on the microwave. 2:14 a.m. I remember thinking, who knocks at this hour? And then telling myself it was probably the neighbor with a package or the maintenance guy fixing the light in the hall. Another knock, harder this time. I padded to the door in my socks and peered through the peephole. The hallway was dim and empty. I leaned in close to the door and called, "Who is it?" A man's voice, low and calm at first, answered, "I'm looking for Lena." I blinked. Lena wasn't a name I knew in this building. I said, "Wrong apartment. You got the number wrong." There was a pause, like he was counting something in his head. He said, "Lena? Are you there, Lena?" I told him again. He had the wrong door. He kept his voice steady, but I could hear it shift, like he was rearranging his words. "Lena, you sure? You moved in last month, right? I've been looking for you." I told him the building had a lot of people move in and out, and no, I wasn't Lena. I tried to sound casual, the way I would if someone had just rung the wrong bell. He didn't move away. He kept saying the name, softer at first, then louder, as if raising his voice would make me answer. The next knock sounded like a fist, sharp and angry. My stomach dropped. I told him to leave. He laughed once, a short, ugly sound, and said, "Don't play games. Lena, open up." I went back to the living room and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking a little when I dialed 911. I half expected the operator to tell me to wait it out or to say it would be fine. Instead, she asked me calm, practical questions. My address, a description of the man, whether he was armed. I told her everything I could. The voice, the knocking, the way he kept saying that name. She said an officer would be dispatched and gave me an estimated time. 10 to 15 minutes. She told me to stay on the line if I wanted. Staying on the line felt useless. The apartment suddenly looked too small, like the walls had closed in. I backed away from the door and dragged the little dining chair over so I could wedge it under the handle. It squealed on the laminate floor and felt ridiculous and fragile, but it eased something in me, gave me a thing to do besides stand there and imagine him trying the knob again. Outside, I could hear the air in the stairwell shift when someone moved across the landing. He used a key, one sharp click, then the handle turning. He didn't get the lock. He tried again. The sound of metal on metal made my jaw clench. I whispered into the phone that he was trying to get the door. The operator stayed calm, told me to stay put, to keep the door blocked. It felt like a script I was reading from someone else's life. The man's voice changed. It stopped being patient and got rougher, like someone grinding their teeth. He started to shout the name, banging on the door now, fists thudding. He yelled, "Lena, open up, I know you're in there." He sounded close enough to spit. I could hear the bass of his voice through the wood, the way the floor vibrated when he stomped. I went to the window to look out, trying to figure out who had the audacity to stand there and scream at my door. Through the blinds, I could see only the pale rectangle of the hallway light and the top of the stairwell. No silhouette. It hit me like a cold wave that he could be standing right there, staring at the peephole, watching whatever was beyond the glass. The idea of someone standing inches from my face and not being visible from the peephole made my skin crawl. Knocking turned into scratching, like fingernails dragging at the wood. It wasn't deep at first, just little scuffs that sounded like someone testing the edges of the lock. Then he started to jam the metal of a key into the latch and twist. The lock made a dreadful scraping noise. That scraping got louder until it sounded almost liquid, metal against metal, like someone trying to pry the whole thing out. "Please," I said into the phone. "He's trying the lock. He's getting..." Something hit the door hard enough that the chair slipped. It was the kind of impact that makes your chest tighten, like thunder. I had the stupid thought that if I opened the door, I could reason with him, tell him he had the wrong person, show him an ID. Then I pictured his face when I could see it, and I felt frozen. The operator told me the unit was 2 blocks away and moving fast. She told me to stay in a room where I could lock the door. I bolted my bedroom door, even though it sounded ridiculous, 2 doors between me and the man, and moved the dresser in front of it. I picked up a lamp and stood behind it like that was a weapon. The banging changed. It softened to a kind of testing, like he was listening for me to slip up. He called the name over and over, each time angrier, each time louder, until he was practically shouting at the top of his lungs. "Lena, I'm not leaving. Open up." My mind kept circling back to that name. I had never heard it in this building. I thought maybe he knew the layout, maybe he'd been told by someone who lived here, or maybe he'd seen a social post. The not knowing made me sick. Then something else happened. The hallway light flicked. Just once, a blink, like someone had tapped the breaker box. The sudden dimness made the shadows pool. The man's voice got a little deeper, angrier. He started rattling the knob like he had new energy, like he'd found a fresh idea. He kicked the door hard enough to rock my apartment. The plaster rattled. I thought, for a second, he might break through. The thought made my throat close up. I squeezed my eyes shut and imagined the police car's headlights at the end of the block. They arrived 5 minutes later than the estimate, but they arrived. I heard the cruiser pull up and the doors slam. The banging stopped like someone had flipped a switch. For a second, there was only the noise of my own breathing and the distant radio crackle from the officer's car. Then footsteps paced down the hallway, heavy and purposeful. Voices called, "Police! Open the door!" I moved to the peephole, heart trying to leap out of my throat. The officers tested the lock, called out to the man, but there was no answer at my door. One of them tried the handle while another shined a flashlight into the hallway. They asked me to open the door slowly. I did, wedging the chair out of the way. The hallway smelled like oil and old smoke. The light in the stairwell stuttered. There was no man standing there. No one hiding in the corners. No trace of boots in the dust. Except, when the officer knelt and put his hand on the lock, he traced his finger around the metal and then straightened. "He tried to force this," he said, sounding more annoyed than alarmed. He pointed at jagged marks around the latch, grooves and scrapes where something had been jammed and twisted. There were fresh scratches down the door frame, too, like someone had clawed at the wood. "You okay?" one of them asked, and I nodded so hard my neck hurt. One of the officers took a statement while the other went to check the hall and the stairwell. They radio snapped something about a unit circling the block. The officer who'd checked the door told me I had better luck than some people. He sounded like he meant it, and suggested I stay with a friend for the night. They offered to have an officer do a walkthrough until I left. I packed a bag with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The building manager showed up with a flashlight and a key ring larger than my hand. He looked at the lock, cussed under his breath, and said he'd have it changed first thing in the morning. The officer on duty said he'd file the report and to call if the guy came back. I left the apartment door open while I moved down the hall, the night air feeling oddly alive. On the stairwell landing, someone had dropped a small black object, maybe a key fob, and an officer picked it up with gloves. They called it in. I watched them radio the description and thought about how close I'd come to answering my door, to seeing whatever face belonged to that voice. Outside, the street smelled like rain, though it hadn't rained. My neighbor across from me, a woman I'd only ever waved at, had come out with a blanket and asked if I was okay. I said I wasn't sure I was, and she led me to her car and offered to drive me to my sister's place 2 towns over. I accepted because it felt like the only thing that might make the noise stop inside my head. The police drove slowly behind us as we pulled away, lights off, like they were keeping an eye until I was out of sight. I watched my building from the rear view until it shrank into the distance, the hallway light a pale box in the dark. The scratches around my lock looked like proof that something had happened, that the panic at my door hadn't been a dream. The scratches were there for the cops to log, for the manager to curse at, for someone to remember. Later, in the bright kitchen of my sister's house, with a mug of coffee warming my hands, I did what everyone told me to do. I changed all my locks, I filed a report, and I stayed somewhere else for a while. The officers never found him that night. A description went around and flyers were put up. The man who called a wrong name and then tried to make it someone's truth vanished into the city's noise, but the scratches stayed on the frame. A ragged map of how close I'd come to opening the door. I kept thinking about the tone of his voice and the way he used a name like he was hunting for one he'd misplaced, like he was trying names until one fit. That sound stuck with me more than anything else. Less a surprise than an intention. My phone buzzed on the table, and when I looked down, it was Mark's name on the screen with a single message. You need to see this. Now. He lived 3 houses down, a guy I'd worked with for years, and trusted to not prank me over something dumb. I unlocked my screen and walked outside to the backyard while he called. He met me at the gate with his hands full of trash bags and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "This is weird," he said, and when he took my phone back to cue the clip, his fingers were shaking just enough that I could see it. The video was shot vertically like a quick phone job, and the first thing I saw was our backyard at night. My fence, my shed, the swing set, and then a soft, steady glow hovering above the grass. It didn't pulse or flicker. It sat in one place like someone had held a lamp in the dark and refused to let it move. Mark didn't narrate. He didn't need to. He tapped the play bar forward and back to show me the moment again. In the clip, the light stayed fixed as if the world around it had been edited out. The shadows it made on the lawn were oddly clean. No sway from leaves, no interruption from the telephone wire overhead. The video had depth. You could tell it was over the lawn, not a reflection on the shed. For a few seconds, I forgot to breathe. "Where did you shoot that from?" I asked. "By the side of the driveway. I walked down to take the bins out and saw it through your fence. Thought I should call you. Thought you'd want to look." He swallowed and then muttered, "It's not a drone. No sound." We watched it twice more, slow and then at normal speed. The file lagged on the last frame, as if the phone couldn't decide whether to keep the glow in memory. Then Mark hit stop, and his face tightened. "I saved it," he said, "but I want you to see it again before I delete it from my phone, in case it messes with anything." He handed the phone back, and I watched him scroll to the clip and play it. The same soft white orb hovered above my grass, indifferent. When it ended, I handed the phone back to him. He swore he'd email it to me. He said he'd copy it to his laptop. He said he'd back it up. He said all the things you say when you're trying to make something real. An hour later, I texted Mark and asked if he'd sent it. No reply. At 2 the next morning, I knocked on his door. He opened it bleary-eyed and shaking his head. "It's gone," he said without preamble. "I had it. It was here. I swear. I went to show Jenna and the file wasn't there on my phone anymore." He swiped through his camera roll anyway. There were photos of his kids, a sushi receipt, a blurry selfie from last week, no clip from my yard. He checked his cloud backup and the folder that would have held it. Empty. That was the start of it, the thing that made the night feel like something you'd only half enter. You saw something impossible. Everyone agreed that it had been there, and then the small piece of evidence unspooled like a cheap film. There were signs before that night, little things should have paid better attention to and didn't. The porch light had been going dim and bright for a week. Nothing terrible, just a slow stutter at odd hours that I replaced with a new bulb and swore it wouldn't do it again. Winston, my Labrador, had taken to staring at the back fence at night, ears flat, tail tucked, But when I went outside, there was never anything to see. My neighbor, Tanya, told me on Tuesday that she'd woken to her phone buzzing at 3 a.m. with a weather alert that showed a radar pause over our block for exactly 7 minutes. She shrugged it off as a glitch. I kept thinking, that's tech for you. It always does odd things. Between Mark's video and his sudden loss of it, things escalated in ways that were small and specific. The porch camera, the cheap unit I'd stapled up last summer, had a corrupted file the morning after Mark's show and tell. The motion log said activity at 1:12 a.m. Just a white frame. One frame, then nothing. The camera rebooted itself and showed nothing else. I pulled the SD card and plugged it into my laptop. The file was listed but 0 bytes. The software threw errors when I tried to repair it. Card corrupted, it said, and I canned the message like bad advice. I went a week feeling like I'd slipped sideways into an alternate routine where ordinary objects misbehaved. My phone's battery ran down faster than it should. The microwave clock blinked 1:13 a.m. for 2 mornings despite being plugged in and working the rest of the day. Winston refused to go out after sunset, and when he did, he pulled like someone else was holding the leash. I started doing the little things you do to anchor yourself. I checked all the windows before bed. I wrote down the time when I walked the dog. I texted Mark and asked if he'd tried a different phone or computer to transfer the file. He said he had, and that every copy vanished the same way. Present 1 second, gone the next. I tried to be methodical. I borrowed an external drive from work and asked my neighbor Lisa if she'd copy anything she had that night, just in case. She hadn't filmed a thing, but she'd looked out and seen my backyard bathed in a mild light for a few minutes. Like a yard party you didn't know about, she said. Then it stopped, and the whole street smelled weird, kind of like when someone burns copper. She frowned when she said it, like saying it made it more real. We checked the street for physical effects. There were none obvious. No scorch marks, no melted grass, no obvious footprints. In the morning, the lawn looked as it always did, a bit patchy near the swing set. But on the strip of grass near the center of the yard, exactly where the video had shown the glow hovering, I noticed the dew had been pushed down in a tidy oval the size of a coffee table. I ran my hand through it and felt nothing more than the cool dampness of condensed water. The ground underneath felt normal. That lack of damage bothered me more than any burn mark might have. It suggested something that could enter the world quietly and not touch it, like an animal that took only the sound of itself. It made me imagine the light being patient, waiting for the right moment when no one was looking directly, and then leaving without a trace. Mark grew more agitated. He checked and rechecked his phone like someone looking for a letter that might appear in the mailbox at any moment. He called Jenna's parents to ask whether they'd seen anything on their cameras. Nothing. He even tried to bring me the phone and show me where the clip had been stored, but by then the icon for the file was an empty rectangle. His cloud account showed a 0-byte file with the right name and the wrong timestamp. I did what people do. I started to collect coincidences. The streetlight at the corner, newly installed last fall, blinked out for an hour the night after Mark's file disappeared. The radio in my truck cut to static for a full minute while I was pausing at the stoplight where the drive meets the main road. On a Thursday, the neighbor's cat Simon came scratching at my door, soaking wet though it hadn't rained. His fur left a ring on the welcome mat that, when wiped, smelled faintly metallic. There are ways to explain all of that. There are always ways. Electromagnetic interference, a failing sensor, some idiot with a box truck with extra lighting. It's nervous to say you don't have an explanation, because people like to fix things with explanations. I'm the kind of person who likes to name causes and knock them down one by one, but the harder I looked, the less tidy the answers became. One evening, Mark knocked on my door again, eyes hollow, and thrust his phone forward. I didn't believe it, he said, but 2 nights ago, I saw it again. He swore he'd put the phone in airplane mode and taped it under the dash while he filmed. He handed it to me and I watched. The clip began with his driveway, then a white glow above my backyard appeared. It hung, then tilted as if the light had a top and a bottom, and for a breath we watched it breathe. My hands were cold when the file ended. I asked to keep the phone. He looked relieved and let me take it home to copy it to every device I could borrow. I sat in the glow of the laptop and dragged files onto external drives like a man who thinks the act of copying is the same as preserving. The file transferred. I opened it. Black. I looked at the file name. The timestamp had changed from 11:02 p.m. to 3:03 a.m. The file size was 0. I checked the file properties like you check a stopped clock, expecting it to start again. I called Mark. He answered on the first ring. "It's like it never existed," he said. "I swear, Aaron, I could swear." He told me about a smell after the light left, sharp and coppery, that made his mouth taste like pennies. And my dog Benny woke up the next day with his color warm as if someone had been touching it. I started, leaving my laptop on a chair facing the backyard at night, with the external drive connected and the software set to record anything the webcam could see. I left the audio running as a dumb, stubborn machine that might catch something human ears missed. I put the phone on airplane mode and slid it into a Tupperware container on the table. Little rituals to try to stop the evaporation of evidence. Dogs barked across the street sometimes, and the distant sound of an ATV woke me once. By 3 in the morning, I was too tired for vigilance. When I pulled the footage the next morning, the files were there and showed the expected grainy darkness. At 2:58 a.m. there was, according to the timestamp, a white frame. The camera's clock matched my laptop's clock, but the frame was just that, a white square. The video resumed with nothing unusual. The audio had a couple of seconds of a low hum, nothing like thunder, more like the vibration of a distant transformer, but the levels were within normal background noise. I replayed it until my eyes blurred. I stopped telling the story to people who didn't already know. Their faces went polite at the edges when I described the file behaving like a living thing, appearing and disappearing by whim. Maybe it was an artifact, one friend offered. Maybe some compression bug. That answer asked me to believe my eyes and not my hands. There are other small things I'll write down because they mattered to me in the moment. The way my kettle hissed a little higher that week, like it wanted to make noise. The odd way Winston refused to sleep outside, though he loves the porch. The way my watch sometimes read 3:03 after I'd checked it at 11. I kept a list because it made me feel like I was doing something concrete. We never got the video back. Mark's phone was fine otherwise, no other corrupt files, no missing photos, but the clip from my backyard was a hole, and the hole seemed to have a memory of light. He swore he'd tried the shop that specializes in recovery. They ran a dozen tests and sent us a polite email that said files could not be recovered from a 0-byte placeholder. They suggested we preserve the device and not use it to overwrite any potential sectors. We did what we could and then stopped because there isn't much to do beyond that. At night, I find myself standing at the kitchen window more often, not exactly looking for anything but listening for the hush that came before the light. Sometimes, years later, I still slow down when I pass the back gate and glance at the strip of grass where the dew pressed into the soil. It looks like any suburban yard. Nothing else stands out. The neighbors' kids play, the sprinklers come on at dawn. Life keeps its ordinary rhythms. I don't have a picture to show anyone now. I have only the memory of Mark's phone in his hand, the way the video looked, and how we both instinctively reached for proof that we could touch. I also have the memory of the file gone, not lost to human error, not corrupted in the usual way, but absent as if someone had decided the world didn't need another record. Maybe it was a trick of technology. Maybe it was the way some nights fold into others in these neighborhoods, full of cars and radio waves and lights. Or maybe it was something small and patient that hovered long enough to register on a camera and then chose to be unrecorded. I don't know which explanation troubles me more, that something happened and vanished without trace, or that my devices simply refused to keep its memory from me. Either way, I kept the external drive plugged in for months. That's out of habit more than hope. And when friends asked, I told the same story, leaving out the part where I check my phone at night to make sure a stupid file doesn't blink out while I'm sleeping.